Now, let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together. Rain hit the laundry room window the way it always did on the worst nights. Not in sheets, not dramatically, but in that persistent, exhausted ticking that made the whole building feel like it was being slowly typed into darkness. Mara Voss had been awake since 4 a.m, which meant she had technically been awake for nearly 22 hours by the time she gathered her laundry basket and walked the 3 flights down the stairwell, past the doors that leaked television light and cooking smells and the low frequencies of other people's arguments, down into the basement where the laundry room waited like a held breath. She was 31 years old. She had lived in the Calvert building for 3 years. She was by all appearances a functional adult. She paid her rent, she kept her kitchen clean, she returned phone calls within a reasonable window. She had a job doing graphic design for a mid-sized marketing firm that she neither loved nor hated, which she had decided was an acceptable relationship to have with work. She had a therapist she saw every other Tuesday, a small collection of plants she kept successfully alive, and a cat named Flemish, who regarded her with the specific contempt only orange tabbies achieve. She had told herself many times, fine. The day had not been fine. She didn't want to articulate what exactly had gone wrong, because the articulation would make it heavier, would give it dimension and weight, and she was already carrying enough. What she wanted was the specific comfort that only a late-night laundry run could offer. The warm industrial smell of the machines, the soft thump of fabric tumbling in heat, the simple animal satisfaction of taking something dirty and returning it clean. It was the most affordable reset available to her at 2 a.m, and she knew she was using it as one, and she didn't care. Sometimes a person just needed to wash the day off whatever surface it had managed to stick to. The laundry room in the Calvert building was a small rectangular space at the end of the basement corridor, beyond the storage cages and the water heater closet, and the fuse boxes that hummed their own particular kind of displeasure. 4 washers lined one wall, 4 dryers faced them from the other. The floor was grey linoleum that someone had once, decades ago, attempted to make cheerful, with a pattern of small blue squares that had since worn to suggestion. A folding table sat in the centre, its laminate surface scarred by years of zippers and belt buckles. Above it, a single fluorescent tube buzzed and flickered at irregular intervals, in a rhythm that didn't quite become a pattern, but never let you forget it might. The vent in the upper corner of the room exhaled warm air continuously, a humid breath that fogged the small window above the sinks, and made the room feel insulated from the rain outside, from the city outside, from everything that ticked and persisted in the dark. When Mara pushed open the door with her shoulder, the warmth hit her first, soft, enveloping, carrying the ghost of 100 previous cycles, someone else's dryer sheets and someone else's wet denim, and the faint mineral smell of the building's water. She set her basket on the folding table and stood there for a moment, just breathing it in. The room was empty, as she had known it would be. Nobody did laundry at 2:15 on a Wednesday unless they were running from something, and the only thing Mara was running from was her own apartment, which had begun to feel in the last few hours like a space with too many surfaces reflecting her back at herself. The mirror in the bathroom, the dark screen of her laptop, the window with the rain behind it and her own face floating in the glass. She had needed to be somewhere that wasn't full of her. She began sorting her clothes with the mechanical ease of a task performed so many times it had become pure reflex. Darks together, lights together, the few delicate things she folded separately and set aside because they weren't going in the dryer. She had a system. The system was the point. Not because the system was necessary, but because having a system was a way of being a person who had things under control, and right now, performing that identity was the best she could manage. She loaded the closest dryer, third from the left, which was the one she always used because the second from the left ran hot, in a way that had shrunk a sweater she'd loved, and the first and last felt too far toward the edges of things, and stood pressing the clean laundry down into the drum's metal mouth with both hands, pushing it back from where it wanted to spill out over her arms. The metal was already warm from the day's use, residual heat stored in the drum's walls like a memory of previous cycles. She liked this. She liked the idea that the machine held warmth even when empty, that it kept something of what had passed through it. She pushed the door closed. It clicked strangely. Not the solid, final chunk of metal finding its seat, which was the sound she expected, the sound she had heard from this machine 100 times. This was different, sharper, with a secondary click behind the first, like something repositioning itself, like teeth finding the wrong alignment and adjusting. She frowned and pressed the door more firmly, heel of her hand flat against the metal. It clicked again, the same strange doubled sound, and then held, or seemed to hold. She turned the dial to 40 minutes, medium heat, pushed the start button, and listened to the machine shudder awake. The drum began to turn. The tumbling settled into its familiar rhythm, soft impacts as clothes fell against the drum wall, the specific low thunder of a machine doing its work. She exhaled. She hadn't realised she'd been holding tension in her chest until it moved, shifting downward and outward, loosening. This was what she'd come for. This specific permission the machine gave her to stand still and be part of a process that didn't require anything from her mind. Just warmth and rotation and the patient conversion of damp to dry. She pulled herself up onto the folding table the way she always did when she was waiting, sitting on the edge, legs dangling back to the room, and looked at the round porthole window in the dryer door. The clothes tumbled inside, grey and dark, blue and white, strobing in and out of view with each rotation. She could see the corner of a towel, the sleeve of a shirt, the doubled thickness of her jeans. Everything accounted for, everything as it should be. The vent above her exhaled, and the warmth settled around her shoulders like a hand. She thought about the day. She hadn't wanted to, but thoughts didn't ask permission. They arrived the way weather arrived, moving in from regions you couldn't see, and settling over everything until visibility dropped to nothing. The day had involved her ex-boyfriend calling her twice and hanging up both times without leaving a message. It had involved a creative brief she'd spent 3 weeks developing being rejected at the last possible moment, just before presentation, by a client who had changed his mind about the entire direction of the campaign and wanted to go a different way entirely. Could she have something new by Friday? It had involved her discovering, while eating lunch alone at her desk, that the friend she had been closest to for the last several years had apparently been in a new relationship for 3 months without telling her, something Mara had found out through the specific cruelty of social media rather than through an actual conversation. None of these things were catastrophic. She knew this. She had the kind of functional self-awareness that came from enough therapy to understand the difference between a genuinely bad day and a day that felt worse than it was because she was tired and emotionally thin. She knew that the client could be managed and the friend could be called and her ex's silence was not her problem, and everything would look different after sleep. She also knew, at 2:15 in the morning, with the rain ticking against the basement window, that knowing these things and feeling them as true were entirely separate operations that her brain was currently refusing to perform simultaneously. So she sat on the folding table and listened to the dryer and let the warmth work on her the way heat works on sore muscle, slowly and from the outside in. The vent pulsed. She noticed it only because she'd been so still. The warmth had been continuous, an ambient current, but now it came in a specific long exhalation, as if something had taken a slow breath and released it. She looked up at the vent cover, the dusty metal louvers angled toward the room. Another pulse of warm air, longer this time, with a pause before it came. She looked back at the dryer window, towel, shirt sleeve, jeans, the rotation continuing, clothes falling and catching and falling. The vent exhaled again. She realised, with the particular discomfort of noticing something she couldn't unnotice, that the pulse had matched her own exhale. She had breathed out, long and slow, and the vent had exhaled at the same time, the same duration, the same weight of released air. She told herself this was coincidence. This was absolutely coincidence. Vent cycled on the building's HVAC system, which operated on timers and thermostats and all manner of mechanical logic that had nothing to do with the breathing patterns of tired women sitting on folding tables at 2 in the morning. She was sleep-deprived and emotionally raw, and she was projecting. That was the word her therapist used, projecting, taking the texture of your own interior state and spreading it over the available surface of the exterior world until everything outside you seemed to be responding to everything inside you. She breathed in. The vent held. She breathed out. The vent exhaled, long and warm, directly above her. Mara got off the folding table. She stood in the centre of the room and looked at the vent and told herself to stop it. The vent ran on building systems. The dryer ran on electricity. The rain ran on meteorology. None of these things were interested in her breathing. The room was warm and she was tired, and her brain was doing what tired, emotionally depleted brains did, which was find patterns in noise and assign them significance, because the alternative, that the day had been randomly difficult without symbolic meaning, was somehow worse. The dryer thumped. Clothes fell against the drum wall. The rotation continued. She went back to the folding table, picked up her phone, and tried to make herself scroll through something meaningless. A cooking account, a photography account. Images of other places and other lives sliding past her thumb in a stream that required nothing, meant nothing, asked nothing of her except to keep moving. This was a normal activity for a normal person at an abnormal hour. She could do this. The dryer's tumbling settled, then shifted. The rhythm changed. Not dramatically, not broken, but slightly altered, in the way a heartbeat alters when something affects the body, the intervals between impacts becoming marginally more deliberate. Thump, pause, thump, more considered, like a pace slowing to match. Mara put her phone down and looked at the porthole window. Towel, shirt, jeans, then something pale. Between rotations, catching the light differently from everything else. A pale, narrow thing crossing the lower quadrant of the window and disappearing behind the tumble of darker clothes. She frowned. She pressed her face closer to the porthole glass, which was warm against her cheek, and waited for the next rotation. Towel, shirt, jeans. The pale thing again, gone before she could properly see it, slipping behind the towel, vanishing into the falling mass. A sock, she thought. Just a sock that had gotten turned inside out and was catching the light oddly. She had a pair of pale grey tube socks. They could read almost white under certain light, and the dryer's interior bulb was the specific sickly yellow of a machine that hadn't had its bulb changed in several building management cycles. A pale sock looked nearly white under that light. It was a sock. But she'd put those socks in the washer earlier, and the washer had finished and she'd moved everything into the dryer herself, and she didn't own any white socks. She owned pale grey and black, and a single pair of wool hiking socks she only brought out in winter. Nothing white. And as she watched the porthole, the pale thing appeared again, not between clothes this time, momentarily alone in the lower left portion of the window, its edges clearly visible before the towel fell over it. And it was definitely a sock, pale to the point of near white, and she definitely had not put it in there. She went to the dryer and pressed the pause button. The drum slowed. The motor hummed down from its working register to a lower idle note. The clothes shifted and settled against the lower curve of the drum as the rotation stopped, and Mara bent and looked through the porthole at close range, nose nearly touching the glass, the heat emanating from the door warming her face. Towel, bunched. 2 shirts, wound around each other, her jeans, heavy at the bottom, a washcloth, the corner of a pillowcase, no pale sock. She opened the door. Heat exhaled, a dense, body-warm gust that carried the smell of her detergent and hot fabric, and something else underneath, something mineral and intimate like the inside of a hand. The clothes shifted as the fresh, cooler air of the room reached in among them. She moved things, the towel, the shirts, the pillowcase, running her hands through the laundry, the way you search for something you've dropped in. Grass, systematic and increasingly certain you're not going to find it. Nothing pale, nothing white, no extra sock. She was standing with both arms inside the dryer, hands deep in her own warm laundry, when the door clicked behind her arm. Just once. The same doubled clicking she had heard at the beginning, teeth finding alignment, metal mouth adjusting. She pulled back fast and the door swung open, not closed, swinging outward as if it had always been open, as if it had been testing the available space and found her arm in it and decided to wait. Mara stood upright and looked at the door. Just a door. Standard dryer door. Metal and glass and the hinges that allowed the porthole to swing outward for loading. No teeth. No mechanism she hadn't seen before. Just the normal industrial components of a machine built to do a simple job. She closed the door, firmly, with the flat of her palm. Click, click. That doubled sound. She stood back from the dryer and she felt the first reel. Thread of something she wasn't willing to call fear yet. She was 31 and she was tired, and she was standing in her own building's basement laundry room where she had stood 100 times, and she was not going to call what she was feeling fear. She was going to call it alertness, heightened awareness. The kind of state that arrived when the environment gave you ambiguous signals and your nervous system, still running very old and very cautious software, decided to pay closer attention until it could determine whether the ambiguity was meaningful. She sat back down on the folding table. The vent breathed. She breathed. She was not going to let them match. She took a deliberately long breath in, held it, then let it out quickly, short, sharp, and watched the vent. The vent released a long, slow exhalation. It wasn't matching her. Or rather, she corrected herself, it was running on its own system that happened to produce warm air pulses at intervals that sometimes coincided with her breathing and sometimes didn't, and she'd been cherry-picking the coincidences because her brain was doing the tired pattern-finding thing, and she needed to stop. She pressed the start button again. The drum turned. The motor climbed back to its working register. The tumbling resumed. Thump, 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 and she watched the porthole. Towel, shirts, jeans, pillowcase. The pale sock appeared, right in the centre of the porthole window, directly framed, occupying the visual field as if positioned there deliberately, and it rotated slowly. Not with the tumble of the other clothes, not being thrown around by the drum's motion, but almost floating in the heat, turning in a gentle rotation, as if showing her all sides of itself. It was a single tube sock, thin cotton, almost luminous against the dark background of her other laundry. It had no mate visible. It showed no sign of being the same pale grey as her socks. It was simply white, specific and strange, and it held its position in the window for 3 full seconds before the towel came round and covered it. Mara crossed the room in 2 steps, hit the pause button again, and yanked the door open before the drum had fully stopped. Heat. Smell. Clothes shifting and settling. She reached in with both hands this time, pulling things out, dropping them on the floor, not caring about wrinkles or cleanliness, pulling the towel out, pulling the shirts out, pulling the pillowcase out, reaching all the way to the back of the drum where the drum met the back wall of the machine, and running her hands around the entire interior circumference, feeling the metal fins and the drum wall and the heating elements housing and the corners where the drum wall met the back seal. No sock, no pail, no white, nothing that didn't belong. She stood there with half her laundry on the floor and her face and chest still in the open dryer, and her hands on the interior metal, and the heat was too much. It was too much. Too warm. Too close. Pressing against her face and chest and arms with the specific pressure of enclosed heat. The metal under her hands was not the residual warmth of a cycle running. It was body temperature. Precisely and disturbingly body temperature. The temperature of something that had been warm for its own reasons and not mechanical ones. She pressed her palms flat against the drum wall and felt it, warm and slightly yielding the way skin yields, not the hard metal warmth she expected, not the conductance of heated steel, but something softer beneath it, as if the drum had developed a layer of warmth that was its own. She pulled back. She stepped away from the dryer. She looked at her hands. Her hands were fine. Her hands were warm from being inside a running dryer, which was exactly what you would expect. There was nothing on her hands. There was no reason to look at her hands as if she expected to find something on them. She was behaving, she told herself, like someone who had watched too many horror films at formative ages and was now retrieving those films from deep storage and projecting their imagery onto a situation that was a malfunctioning dryer door, and HVAC patterns, and her own exhausted nervous system. She picked up her laundry from the floor and put it back in the drum and closed the door and did not press start. She stood with her back against the folding table and looked at the dryer, and below the official narrative she was running, the rational narrative, the reasonable narrative, she felt the thing that was actually happening, which was that she was afraid of a laundry machine at 2:30 in the morning in the basement of her apartment building, and that this fear was not coming from nowhere, and that the part of her that ran very old software was fully operational and had been registering something for the last 15 minutes, that the newer, more articulate software had been working very hard to explain away. The vent pulsed, once, long and slow, and then a sound she had not heard before, underneath the machine's idle hum, underneath the HVAC's white noise, underneath the rain against the window, a sound like something turning slowly in a small space. Not the drum, which was still, not the motor, which was idling. Something within the machine, something in the space behind the drum, where the heating element and the motor housing and the ductwork all came together in the dark interior she could not see, was making the sound of slow rotation, as if something in there was keeping warm, as if something in there was keeping itself oriented. In this building, the older tenant said, you could set your watch by sock hollow, not because it kept any kind of time you could use, but because it kept its own kind. Mara had lived in the Calvert building for 3 years, and she had heard the name twice, once from the woman in 2B who had lived there for decades and mentioned it in the specific, offhand way that people who have made their peace with something mention the thing they have made their peace with, and once from the super's assistant, a young man named Dale, who maintained the building's infrastructure with the particular competence of someone who had learned to work around things he didn't fully understand. She had taken both mentions as local colour, the kind of building mythology that develops in old structures, in places where pipes knock and floors settle, and the machinery of daily life accumulated decades of quirk and history. Buildings collected legends the way they collected water damage, slowly, inevitably, in the dark places you didn't check often enough. She had not, on either occasion, taken Sock Hollow seriously. She took herself seriously. She took her rational framework seriously, her evidence-based approach to reality, her commitment to explanations that did not require supernatural agency. She was not the kind of person who believed in things that couldn't be measured. She was the kind of person who believed in exhaustion and pattern-seeking brains and the specific ambient horror of being alive in a world that mostly didn't care what you needed. Sock Hollow, the story went, and she was pulling at the fragments of it now the way you pull at a thread you're not sure you want to unravel. It was not exactly a ghost. It was not exactly a creature in the conventional sense. It was a specific kind of presence that had grown in the building's infrastructure the way fungus grew in wall cavities, fed by something organic, sustained by something the building produced in particular conditions, flourishing in the specific microclimate of warmth and moisture and human need that a late-night laundry room created. It fed on comfort, specifically on the comfort of clean starts. She remembered the woman in 2B saying this with a half-smile, as if the woman found it cosmically funny, or cosmically appropriate, or possibly both. The idea that what sustained the thing in the dryers was not blood or life force or any of the traditionally dramatic currencies of the supernatural, but specifically the comfort of believing that washing things could make you new. The hope attached to a warm cycle, the specific vulnerable faith of standing in a laundry room at 2 a.m. and believing that what came out of the dryer would be better than what went in. Mara was standing in a laundry room at 2 a.m, and she had felt exactly that faith when she walked in, and she felt its absence now, which was its own specific sensation. The hollow where comfort had been, the cavity left by removed hope, slightly larger than the hope itself in the way that holes are always slightly larger than the things that made them. She looked at the dryer. The dryer looked back, or not back. It was a machine, and it did not look, and she was not going to assign it looking. The porthole window reflected the fluorescent light, slightly fogged from the warmth inside, slightly convex in the way porthole glass was slightly convex, creating a mild fisheye effect that made the interior of the drum appear to curve away from her at the edges. She pressed start. Not because she had decided everything was fine, not because she had resolved the question of the pale sock or the breathing vent or the body temperature drum wall or the sound of slow rotation behind the machine's rear housing. She pressed start because she was not going to be driven out of her own building's laundry room at 2:30 a.m. by a combination of HVAC quirks and her own sleep-deprived pattern recognition, and she was going to finish her laundry, and she was going to take it upstairs, and she was going to fold it and go to sleep, and in the morning everything was going to look different because morning was the specific cure for 2:30. The drum turned. The clothes tumbled. The pale sock appeared immediately, centre window. Still. Back. Which was not watching, she told back. Which was not watching, she told herself. Which was not watching. A sock could not watch. It was cotton and elastic and probably someone's lost laundry item that had been in the dryer before her, and she simply hadn't found it in her previous 2 searches because she'd been rushing and not systematic enough. And this was the sock had a face. Not a printed face. Not a decorated face. Not the kind of novelty sock face that someone might wear on their feet by choice. Something had happened to the cotton surface. A compression, a staining, an arrangement of fibre and shadow that created in the porthole's warm light the unmistakable impression of features. 2 dark compressions where eyes would be. A horizontal crease that formed a mouth, and the mouth was open, and something darker than shadow occupied the open space. Mara hit the power button. Not the pause button. The power button. She turned the machine off. She stepped back until she hit the folding table. She stood against the table and watched the dryer wind down, the drum decelerating, the motor noise dropping register by register, until the machine was silent, and she waited, in the silence, for the next thing to happen. The fluorescent light above her ticked, once. The vent exhaled, slow, warm, like a very patient breath. The dryer door, without being touched from the inside from something pressing outward against the porthole glass, clicked. The doubled sound, teeth finding alignment, metal adjusting to accommodate, and then the door swung open, 3 inches, the hinge working without any visible agency, the gap releasing a billow of warm air that smelled strongly, specifically, of the inside of something organic, something lived in, something that had warmth because it was warm, and not because it had been mechanically heated. She did not scream. She was proud of this later, in the way survivors are sometimes proud of the wrong things, the superficial composures they maintained while the larger collapses were occurring. She did not scream. She also did not move. She stood against the folding table with her hands braced on the laminate surface, and she looked at the 3-inch gap in the dryer door and she breathed. And she was aware that the vent was breathing too, and this time she did not try to unnotice the synchronization. From the gap between the door and the dryer frame at the level of the porthole, something pale moved. She was not certain she saw it. She was certain she did not want to be certain. It was at the edge of the perceptible, a pallor at the gap's edge, a brief extrusion of pale fabric through the 3-inch space, folding against the outside of the dryer door like something pressing to get out, like something that had been folded, tightly in the dark and was slowly, in increments, unfolding. And then, she was certain of this, she was certain, the dryer door clicked shut. From the inside, The latch engaging, the door sealing, the porthole glass going opaque with fogged warmth, and the silence of the machine, now off, now still, now holding whatever it was holding in the dark behind its sealed door. Mara picked up her basket. She did not retrieve her laundry from the dryer. She understood this as a loss she was accepting in order to leave the room more quickly, and she accepted it with the specific blankness of a mind that had performed its analysis and reached its conclusion, and was now waiting for the body to finish processing the information and move. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the door handle, the metal cool and real and normal under her hand, when she heard it, behind her, from the dryer, which was off, which was sealed, which held her laundry in the dark behind its fogged glass door, the sound of slow tumbling, not fast, not the driven tumble of a machine at work, just the slow, voluntary rotation of a drum turning at its own pace, in its own time, as if keeping warm, as if keeping something in motion, as if practicing. She went through the door. She went up the 3 flights of stairs at a pace that she refused to call running, which was a slow run, a fast walk, a controlled retreat. She went into her apartment and locked the door and sat on her couch with Flemish, who looked at her with his amber eyes and then, apparently deciding she wasn't interesting enough to deal with right now, turned around 3 times and went back to sleep. She sat with him. She breathed. Outside the window the rain ticked on. Her laundry was still in the dryer. She knew she would have to go back for it. She also knew she would not be doing that tonight. She was wrong about the morning making things look different. The morning made things look the same as they had looked the night before, with the additional clarity that daylight brought to situations that you could no longer blame on darkness. She had been frightened by a dryer. She had left her laundry in the machine. She had walked back upstairs in a fast walk that was a slow run. She sat with this information over coffee and tried to construct an interpretation that didn't require her to take any of the previous night's experiences at face value, and the interpretation she constructed was exhaustion, grief. She was going to use that word for what had been accumulating over the previous months. Grief, because her therapist had suggested it and the word had the right weight. And a nervous system still running very old software that had made several very understandable category errors in a warm basement room at 2:30 in the morning. This interpretation was functional. It allowed her to drink her coffee and feed Flemish and open her laptop and respond to several work emails and generally occupy the morning like a person who had not been frightened by a laundry machine. She was good at occupying mornings this way. She had been good at it for some time. She went back to the laundry room at 10:15 when she knew Mrs. Aponte from 1A would probably be down there with her enormous Saturday loads, which she did every Thursday because Mrs. Aponte had been doing laundry on Thursday mornings for 20 years and saw no reason to change. The presence of another person in the room was not something Mara analysed. She simply went at 10:15 and was glad when Mrs. Aponte was there, folding a fitted sheet with the specific frustrated technique that fitted sheets required. Her dryer was open. Her laundry was on the folding table loose, not in her basket. Someone had moved it. Someone had taken it out of the dryer and placed it on the folding table. She stood in the doorway and looked at the clothes on the table, and then at Mrs. Aponte, who was fighting her fitted sheet with increasing determination. "Did you take my laundry out?" Mara asked. Mrs. Aponte looked up. "Your machine was finished. Wanted to use it." "When did you get here?" 8 o'clock. Mrs. Aponte went back to her sheet. "Your clothes were already dry when I got here. Left them on the table." Mara walked to her laundry and began putting it in her basket, item by item. Towel, shirts, jeans, pillowcase, the washcloth, all present, all accounted for. She picked up something from the bottom of the pile, a sock, white. Thin cotton tube sock, almost luminous, so clean it looked new, lying at the bottom of the pile of her dark clothes as if it had been placed there deliberately, folded once, with a neatness that her own laundry practices never produced. She held it up. It had no mate on the table. It was not hers. Mrs. Aponte looked over. "Oh, I found that in the drum when I cleared your things. Figured it must be yours." "It's not," Mara said. Mrs. Aponte shrugged with the magnificent disinterest of someone who had made their peace with her building's mechanics long ago. "Then it belongs to nobody. Happens all the time. Leave it on the table if you want. It'll disappear eventually." She said the last 3 words with a very small smile and went back to her fitted sheet. Mara put the sock in her basket. She wasn't sure why. It seemed, in the moment, better to have it in her possession than to leave it on the table where it could, as Mrs. Aponte had said, disappear eventually. Having it felt like a form of control, even if she couldn't articulate what kind. That night she found it on her kitchen counter. She had placed the basket in her bedroom closet and had not put anything from it on the kitchen counter, but there it was, neatly folded, alone on the white tile counter next to the dish rack, as if it had moved itself from the basket to the kitchen while she was at work. Flemish was sitting next to it with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual because Flemish was generally a very readable cat, and the expression he was currently offering was not any of the standard 3: contempt, hunger, or the specific predatory focus he applied to flying insects and the shadows of ceiling fans. He looked, she decided after a moment, like a cat that was watching something she couldn't see. She picked up the sock and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept batteries and rubber bands and take-out menus, under the stack of menus, and she closed the drawer. She made dinner and didn't think about it, and that was a lie. She thought about it consistently for the entire evening, in the way you think about a word that's stuck in your head, or a splinter you can feel but can't find, present at the periphery of everything, demanding a small portion of her attention even when she tried to direct all of it somewhere else. She opened the drawer at 11 o'clock, and the sock was gone. In its place, arranged with the same folded neatness, was one of her own socks. A black wool one that she had owned for years, one of a pair, a sock she was certain was in her drawer upstairs. She walked to her sock drawer and looked and found a single black wool sock where there had been a pair, and she stood looking at the half-depleted pair for a long time. Then she went back to the kitchen, picked up the black wool sock from the battery drawer, and took it upstairs to her bedroom, and she put both socks, the remaining one from the drawer and the one from the kitchen, in a shopping bag and tied the top of the shopping bag and put the shopping bag on the high shelf of her closet that she couldn't reach without the step stool, behind the boxes of archived paperwork and the winter things she didn't access until December. She went to sleep at midnight and woke at 3:45 to Flemish sitting on her chest, which he never did, staring at the closet with both ears forward, and from the high shelf of the closet behind the boxes of paperwork and the winter coats from inside the shopping bag she had tied and placed in the most inaccessible part of her storage, she heard the sound she had first heard in the laundry room, slow rotation, deliberate and patient, in a small, warm space. The building had stood on this corner since 1947. It had been, in successive incarnations, a residential hotel, an SRO, a renovated mid-market apartment building that had managed the transition from one demographic to another, with the typical mix of improvement and erasure that such transitions involved. It had 16 units across 6 floors, 2 apartments per floor except for the first, which had 3 smaller ones and the building's lobby and the basement access. It had 423 square feet of laundry space and approximately 2 miles of pipe and ductwork running through its walls, and it had, in one form or another, housed human beings and their particular forms of hope and disappointment for 78 years. Buildings, collected things. Everyone who lived long in a building understood this at some level, even if they didn't talk about it. The way certain spaces felt different from adjacent spaces, the way some rooms stayed colder, the way some doors always stuck and some always opened too easily. Buildings collected the energy of their occupants the way old wood collected moisture, slowly and thoroughly, and some buildings, in particular conditions, under particular pressures, accumulated enough that the accumulation began to behave. Sock Hollow was not the building itself. This was important to understand. It was not the building's ghost or spirit or anima. It was something that had found the building the way organisms find habitats, attracted by specific conditions, sustained by specific resources, growing into the available space. The warmth was essential, the moisture was essential, the human use was essential, but most essential was the resource that the laundry room produced in concentrated form. Hope. Specifically, the hope of transformation. The specific faith that a clean cycle could convert a day's difficulty into something manageable, that warmth and rotation could return comfort to fabric and, by extension, to the person wearing it. This was not a magical faith. It was a thoroughly human one. Everyone who had ever put clothes in a dryer and stood waiting for them knew the feeling. The specific comfort of anticipation, of warm things about to be returned, of the process working as promised. It was reliable. It was modest. It was one of the smallest and most achievable forms of comfort available in domestic life, and its reliability was precisely what made it valuable, and its value was precisely what made it attractive to something that fed on value. The old tenants who knew about Sock Hollow, who had encountered it over years of late-night loads and missing socks and dryers that breathed, described it in terms that were less creature-like and more ecological, the way you might describe a weather pattern or a microbial process. It was less a being with intentions and more a process with effects. It was what happened when enough human need collected in one warm place over enough time. It ate comfort. It returned pieces of things. It was drawn particularly, unavoidably, to people who came to the laundry room not just to clean clothes, but to clean themselves, to reset, to perform the ritual of transformation that laundry represented. Those people, the old tenants said, fed it best. Their hope was richest. Their faith was most concentrated, and when it ate that, it grew, and when it grew, it became more capable of taking more. Mara Voss, arriving at 2:15 in the morning with a full basket and a specific hunger for reset, had been, she understood now in the retrospective clarity of information arriving too late, exactly what Sock Hollow had been waiting for. She went back to the laundry room on Friday night. She went. Deliberately, not with laundry. She had done laundry at the laundromat on the corner, paying twice as much as the building machines cost, surrounded by strangers and fluorescent light, and the specific ordinary noise of a public facility, and it had been fine, and her clothes were clean, and she had felt nothing in particular loading them into the machines or taking them out. No vent synchronizing to her breathing, no pale sock appearing in the porthole, no clicks from the door that sounded like teeth. Just a laundromat on a Thursday afternoon, functional and impersonal, and blessedly inert. She went back to the building's laundry room on Friday night because she'd thought about Mrs. Aponte's small smile for 2 days, and had finally asked her about it directly, meeting Mrs. Aponte in the lobby on Friday morning, and stopping her with the specific manner of someone who had decided to ask a question they might not want answered. Mrs. Aponte had told her. Standing in the lobby, hand still on the mail slot she'd just checked, Mrs. Aponte had told Mara what she knew about Sock Hollow, which was more than what the younger tenants knew, and considerably more than Mara had wanted to hear. She'd told her about the breathing, about the pale sock, about the face. She'd told her that this happened to people who came to the laundry room with the wrong kind of need. Not cleaning need, she specified, but transforming need. The kind where you expected the process to do more than clean your clothes. The kind where you needed it to work on something the machine couldn't actually reach. She'd told her about the rule. The rule, Mrs. Aponte explained, was simple and specific, and had to be followed exactly, which was the nature of rules about things you didn't fully understand. Precision became a substitute for comprehension. If the dryer started breathing in your rhythm, you had 3 things to do. Stop the cycle. Leave 1 clean sock on top of the machine. Clean, warm, taken directly from the basket, not found on the floor and definitely not retrieved from the drum. And accept silently, in the specific silence of not speaking into the open drum, 1 thing you could not fix that night. Not forever. Just tonight. The distinction Mrs. Aponte had emphasized was critical. Not acceptance of permanent loss, not capitulation, just the specific, humble acknowledgement that some things couldn't be resolved in a laundry cycle. 1 thing, named inside your head, not said aloud, not bargained over, just accepted with the clean specificity of putting it down and leaving it there, the way you left a sock on the machine. Mara had asked what happened if you didn't follow the rule, Mrs. Aponte had told her. So Mara went back to the laundry room on Friday night. Not with laundry. With 1 clean sock from the drawer, a fresh pair she'd bought that afternoon, unopened, which felt important in a way she couldn't fully articulate but trusted, and with the intention of following a rule that she still, on some level, felt ridiculous for taking seriously. She was 31 years old. She had a therapist. She had an evidence-based relationship with reality. She was going to follow a folk remedy for a building legend that she had decided, in the 2 days since the pale sock had appeared in her drum, was something she couldn't explain with any of her usual frameworks. She did not turn on the machine, she did not load the machine. She went into the laundry room, which was empty at 10:30 on a Friday night, and she stood in front of the dryer she always used, and she breathed. The vent exhaled. She looked at the porthole. The drum was dark and still. She could see the interior of the drum in the porthole's reflection. The metal fins, the back wall, the darker shadows at the drum's rear. Empty, nothing moving, nothing pale. She stood. The vent exhaled again. She reached into her bag and took out the clean sock she'd brought. It was folded, pristine, still slightly warm from the apartment's heat, carrying nothing except the clean smell of new cotton and the warmth of being near her body for the walk downstairs. She held it in her hands for a moment. It was just a sock. It was a piece of cotton formed into the shape of a foot, created for the function of covering a foot. Not meaningful, not sacred, not significant. She was going to leave it on a machine. She placed it on top of the dryer. She flattened it with her palm, pressing the fold gently into the machine's warm metal surface. She left it there. Then she stood with her hands at her sides and she did the other part. She named it inside her head. She named the thing she couldn't fix tonight. She chose it from the several available options. And there were several, because she was a person of a certain age in a certain life, and the inventory of things she couldn't fix was not short. She chose the one that was truest, the one she had been carrying longest, the one that had nothing to do with the client or the friend or her ex-boyfriend's silence. She chose the thing underneath those things, the thing those things were symptoms of, the specific loss she'd been circling for 8 months since her mother's death. which she had been managing so functionally, so efficiently, so well, that she had occasionally forgotten to let herself understand that it was there. She named it inside her head, the loss of the specific comfort of being known by her mother, the specific warmth of being someone's child, the way that warmth had been one of the things she'd been coming to the laundry room to recover at 2 a.m. The thing she'd been hoping the warm cycle could return because some part of her, the animal part, the part that ran very old software, had been looking for the warmth everywhere since October. She named it. She put it down. She left it there next to the sock. She did not say anything aloud. She kept her mouth completely closed, pressing her lips together against the thing that wanted to burst out, not give it back, not the dangerous words Mrs. Aponte had warned her about, but something else, something equally dangerous, a sound more animal than linguistic, a sound that would have been all the grief she'd been not making since October, and she kept it in, she held it. She stood with her hands at her sides and her mouth closed in the warm laundry room with the vent breathing and the fluorescent light ticking. The dryer door clicked. She looked at it. The porthole was dark, the door was shut, but the click had been different, not the doubled, teeth-finding sound she'd heard before. This was a single clean click, the sound of a latch engaging properly, of a mechanism finding its correct alignment and settling there with satisfaction. The vent exhaled, once, long and warm. Then it continued as normal airflow, steady and uninterrupted, neither synced to her breathing nor opposed to it. Mara stood in the laundry room for 3 more minutes. She counted them on her phone. She wanted to be sure. She breathed normally, and the vent breathed normally, and the dryer door stayed closed, and the porthole stayed dark, and nothing pale moved anywhere visible. She picked up her bag and left. In the hallway outside the laundry room, the smell was damp carpet and detergent. She stood in it and breathed, and felt the difference between the warmth inside the laundry room and the cooler air of the corridor, and she felt in the specific way that things you've been holding down eventually surface. The grief she had named and put down inside the room. It rose in her on the walk upstairs. It arrived fully on the second-floor landing, where she sat down on the steps and put her face in her hands and cried properly for the first time since October. Not the managed, contained crying she'd done in her therapist's office, but the operational, full-body crying that comes when the managed version finally runs out of infrastructure. She cried for 10 minutes on the second-floor landing of the Calvert building. No one came by. The rain had stopped at some point while she was in the laundry room, and the building was quiet, and she cried until she was done, and then she wiped her face with the hem of her shirt and went upstairs and fed Flemish his late snack and went to bed. She slept until 9:30. It was the first time she had slept past 7 in 4 months. But this was not everyone's story, and the Calvert building had other tenants, and Sock Hollow had been there much longer than Mara Voss, and the laundry room at 2 a.m. was not always occupied by people who knew the rule, or followed it, or were prepared to put things down and leave them. The building had 16 units. It had at any given time varying quantities of human difficulty concentrated in its floors and walls, the specific gravity of lives being lived in proximity, under the shared infrastructure of pipes and wiring and load-bearing walls and the building's long memory. Some of this difficulty was small and daily, the ordinary friction of existence. Some of it was large and particular, the kind that sends people to laundry rooms at unusual hours, carrying baskets and a specific hunger for reset. 6 weeks after Mara's Friday night offering, a man in apartment 4C discovered that the dryer wouldn't let him leave. His name was Roger Hale. He was 44 years old. He had been living in the Calvert building for 7 months, having moved in directly from the apartment he'd shared with his wife of 12 years, from which he had departed following a separation that he described to friends as amicable, and felt privately as amputation. He had a son who was 8 years old and who stayed with him every other weekend, and whose laundry Roger washed and dried with a carefulness that was, if you watched him do it, clearly about more than clean clothes. He folded the boys' small shirts with a precision that was not perfectionistic but devotional, the way you handle things that mean more than they can carry. Roger came to the laundry room at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, because his son had gone home to his mother at 6 o'clock, and the apartment had developed, in the hours since, a quality of emptiness that was louder than noise. He brought a full load, mostly his son's things, the weekend clothes the boy had left, 2 pairs of small jeans and 3 superhero shirts and a pair of pyjamas with dinosaurs on them, and he loaded the dryer with a focus that made his hands careful and his chest tight. He did not know about Sock Hollow. He had not lived in the building long enough to accumulate the building's lore. He had not spoken to Mrs. Aponte at any length about anything. He was a man doing laundry at 3 a.m. because the alternative was sitting in a quiet apartment, holding the specific absence of his son, and even the activity of laundry was preferable to that. The dryer door clicked strangely when he closed it. He noticed it and dismissed it. The vent began sinking to his breathing within 4 minutes. He did not notice it. The pale sock appeared in the porthole window at the 11-minute mark of the cycle. He noticed it immediately and felt a complicated thing. Not fear initially, but something like recognition, as if the pale colour in the porthole matched something he'd been carrying, the pale, low-light feeling of the apartment without his son in it. He watched the sock appear and disappear between rotations, and he leaned close to the porthole glass and he said, aloud, without thinking, the way people say things when they are alone, and their interior monologue temporarily externalise, "Just bring it back." He did not mean the sock. The vent exhaled. The drum, which had been running at 40% capacity, began to turn faster. Roger stepped back from the machine. The dryer was accelerating, not dramatically, not into a mechanical emergency, but definitely faster than the setting he'd chosen, the interior temperature rising to a point where he could feel it from 2 feet away, a warmth that was too much, too concentrated, pressing outward through the porthole glass. He pressed the stop button. The machine did not stop. He pressed it again. Nothing. He turned the dial. Nothing. He found the power switch, the physical toggle on the side of the machine that bypassed the electronic controls, and toggled it off. The drum kept turning. The fluorescent light above him flickered and held at a lower register, the tube burning dimmer, as if the room's power was being redistributed toward the machine. The vent above him was breathing hard now, not the slow, steady pulses from before, but fast, shallow exhalations, like something that had been running and was winded, or like something that was excited. He could smell it in the exhaled air, that organic smell, warm and interior, the smell of something living, producing heat. He went to the door of the laundry room and tried to open it. The handle turned. The door did not open. He turned the handle again, more forcefully, putting his shoulder into it. The door moved slightly. He could feel it flex in its frame, the way an interior door flexes when it's sticking from humidity. But it didn't open. He stepped back and looked at the door, and it was a normal door, hollow core, with a standard lever handle, with a gap at the bottom that showed the hallway beyond. He could see the hallway carpet through the gap, the strip of corridor light visible under the door, and there was no visible reason why it shouldn't open. He looked at the hallway light under the door. There was a shadow in it, moving slowly in the space under the door, not the shadow of feet, not the shadow of something walking past, but a low shadow, a creeping thing, something that was low to the ground and moving with the deliberate slowness of something that had identified a threshold it intended to maintain. Roger looked away from the shadow and looked at the dryer. The dryer had his son's clothes in it, the small jeans, the dinosaur pyjamas, the superhero shirts. They were in there, in the drum that was turning without power, in the heat that was rising above the setting he'd chosen, and he was aware, with the specific concrete clarity that arrives when the body's older systems have been alerting without being heard and the brain finally catches up, that the machine should not be running, that the switch was off, that the room's power was dimming to feed the dryer, that the air tasted wrong, that the shadow under the door was moving. He went back to the dryer and grabbed the door handle and pulled. The door resisted, the same resistance as the room's door, a flex without release. The mechanism engaged beyond its mechanical function. He pulled harder. The door's porthole pressed against his forearm as he worked the handle, and the glass was hot. Not warm, not laundry warm, but hot in the way metal gets when something near it has been generating sustained heat, the way an oven door gets, the way you would not press your face against it. Inside the drum, through the hot porthole glass, he could see the clothes tumbling, and among the clothes he could see the sock, the pale sock, no longer just pale but almost luminous, almost phosphorescent, brightening and brightening as the temperature rose, and it was not tumbling with the other clothes. It was moving against the rotation, maintaining a position near the porthole, as if deliberately making itself visible, showing him the face he could now see clearly. Not a compression of cotton fibre, not a trick of shadow, but a face, an actual face, rendered in pale fabric. 2 dark pits for eyes, a mouth open to the diameter of a small fist. The mouth moved. He did not hear it. The drum was turning, the clothes were tumbling, the dryer was producing the sound of its own impossible operation. But the mouth moved, and the movement had the rhythm of a voice, and he read the rhythm, the way people read lips, the repetition of a single phrase, over and over, turning with the drum's rotation, keeping its position at the window. Just bring it back, just bring it back, just bring it back, his own words. Returned to him from inside the machine. Roger's hand came off the door handle, and he stumbled back into the folding table, and the laundry basket he'd come in with fell off the table, and the table's edge caught him in the small of the back, hard enough to hurt, and he sucked in a breath of the room's warm air, which tasted now very strongly of that organic smell, that interior warmth, as if the room itself were the inside of something breathing. The vent was still exhaling in fast shallow pools, the drum was still turning, the light was still low, the shadow under the door had stopped moving. He looked at the gap under the door, the shadow was still there. But now there were two of them, positioned at the door's base like feet, like something crouching on the other side of the door with its face near the floor, waiting. He did not move for a long time. He stood with the edge of the folding table in his back and his heart doing its old software emergency protocol, and he breathed the warm organic air and he did not move. The dryer ran, the sock face moved its mouth, the vent breathed in fast shallow pools, then the light went back to normal. The vent slowed, the dryer motor descended in register, slowed, and stopped. Not violently, gradually, the way a machine, properly winding down, decelerating through its normal registers to silence. The porthole glass cooled rapidly, faster than it should have, faster than metal cooled, the residual temperature dropping away as if the heat had been recalled rather than dissipated. Roger stood at the folding table. He could hear the building, pipe knock from somewhere above, a television from a nearby unit, the far sound of traffic, normal building noise, normal world. He went to the laundry room door and tried the handle. It opened immediately. He stepped into the hallway and looked both ways. The hallway was empty. The corridor was lit normally. No shadows, no presence. The carpet damp-smelling from the outside air that always seeped in around the building's exterior doors at this time of night. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went back into the laundry room and opened the dryer and took out his son's clothes. The dinosaur pyjamas, the superhero shirts, the small jeans. Each one he took out and felt in his hands, checking the temperature. Warm, normal dryer warm, nothing excessive. He put them in his basket. He checked the drum and found nothing pale, nothing that shouldn't be there. He looked at the inside of the porthole glass, which was clear and slightly fogged from the cycle's humidity, and showed him only his own distorted reflection. He carried his son's laundry upstairs. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with the folded small clothes in front of him, folded with the careful devotion of a man doing the only thing he had available to do for his son at 3:30 in the morning. And he thought about the face in the drum and the words it had been forming, and the shadow under the door. Just bring it back. His own words returned. He told himself he had imagined the face. He told himself the sock had been a trick of light, and the face had been pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find faces in neutral surfaces, in clouds, in wood grain, in the compression of cotton fibre. He told himself the door hadn't really been stuck, just swollen from the humidity, just sticking the way interior doors stuck in old buildings. He told himself the shadow under the door had been the shadow of the door's own draft guard, repositioning in the air movement. He told himself all of this while sitting at the kitchen table with his son's folded clothes, and he believed none of it, and in the morning he called his ex-wife and asked if he could see his son today, instead of waiting 2 weeks, and she said yes because she was not a cruel person, and she could hear something in his voice, and he drove over and spent the afternoon at the park with his boy, and pushed him on the swings until his arms ached and held him when he got tired, and felt, in the simple, physical fact of his son's weight against his chest, that specific warmth he'd been trying to recover, which could not be recovered from a machine. He never went to the laundry room at 3 in the morning again. He never went alone. But the Calvert building had other tenants, and Sock Hollow had other hours, and the laundry room at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning received visitors with varying degrees of preparation, and not all of them were as lucky as Roger, who had said the words by accident and received only the demonstration, only the preview, the showing of what the machine could do when it had your hope in its drum and was learning your rhythms, the intimation of what it was building toward if you stayed and kept feeding it. Not all of them left with their laundry and their limbs and the lessons that could be learned from a single bad night. Some of them had been coming to the laundry room for months. Some of them had been feeding it for so long that the machine had learned them thoroughly, had learned their breathing patterns and their grief shapes and the specific quality of their hope. And when those people finally said the words, when they reached for what the machine had been showing them in the porthole window, the door didn't just click, it opened. There was a woman in 3B named Diana Chen, who had been coming to the laundry room since February, which by the time everything resolved had made it 9 months of late-night loads, 9 months of standing in front of the third from left dryer, 9 months of the vent learning her breathing and the machine cataloguing her grief. Diana was 28, and she had been grieving for 2 years. Not the grief of a single loss, but the accumulated grief of a slow failure, a career that had ended before it began when a chronic illness had taken her ability to work in the field she'd trained for, a body she was constantly negotiating with, a life that was narrower than she'd planned, and that she came to the laundry room to temporarily escape. The warmth there was reliable in a way her own warmth often wasn't. The process was controllable in a way her days often weren't. She had become, without knowing the term for it, one of Sock Hollow's regular visitors, a regular feeder, as Mrs. Aponte would have said, though she used the term with pity rather than blame. Diana had seen the pale sock every time for 9 months. She had not told anyone this. She had come to, over the months, think of it as a feature of the room, a quirk of the machine, a residual laundry item that kept appearing because of something in the drum's mechanics, a physical explanation she sustained through 9 months of encounters, because the alternative required her to take seriously a category of explanation she was not prepared to take seriously. She was, like Mara, a functional adult. She was, like Mara, evidence-based. She was, unlike Mara, running a very high deficit in the specific resource that Sock Hollow consumed. Her hope of transformation was rich and concentrated, and had been building in the room's warm air for 9 months, and the machine had been learning her the way you learn a language when you are immersed, until it was fluent. She said the words on a Tuesday night in November, at 1:40 in the morning, when she'd been standing at the porthole watching the pale sock for the 11 minutes of a short cycle, and had been feeling, with increasing desperation, that the warmth of the room was the only warmth available to her, that the clean clothes she was waiting for would be the best thing that happened to her this week, that if she could just have back the feeling she'd had before she knew how sick she was, if the machine could just give back the body she'd been in, the future she'd been heading toward, the specific shape of a life that had been hers before the diagnosis, if it could just. She said it out loud into the porthole glass, her breath fogging the round window. Give it back, please, give it back. The dryer door opened, not out, in. The porthole glass swung inward, which was physically impossible. The door was hinged to open outward. It had always opened outward. The hinge was on the outside of the drum's circumference. The door could not open inward. But it did. The porthole glass swung slowly inward into the drum space, and the heat that came out was not the heat of a dryer cycle, not the wet fabric heat of 60 degrees Celsius, but something denser and more interior, something with the temperature of a living thing's core, the heat of the deep inside of a warm body, and the smell was not detergent and fabric. It was the smell of something that had been keeping warmth for a very long time. Diana did not step back. She had been there 9 months. She had been running a deficit for 2 years. The warmth hit her, and she stayed. The sock came out first. It came through the open porthole on its own, not falling, not tumbling, but extending, the way you extend a hand through an opening. Pale and narrow, folding itself over the porthole rim, and Diana watched it come, and felt the warmth on her face from the open drum, and did not step back. The sock touched her hand where it rested on the doorframe. It was warm. It was not warm like fabric was warm in a dryer. It was warm the way a hand was warm when it closed over yours. The specific warmth of contact with something alive. Diana stood with the sock against her fingers and felt, for the first time in months, warm in a way that came from outside her body rather than from the interior effort of maintaining herself, and she made a sound that was not a word, just the sound of someone who's been very cold for a very long time suddenly not being cold. The drum behind the open porthole was dark. She could not see the drum's interior. The open porthole was dark, not the mechanical darkness of an empty drum, but the occupied darkness of a space that was full of something she couldn't see. The darkness had texture. It was warm and it breathed, and the breathing was not the vents. It came from inside, from the drum's interior, from the dark space through which she'd been watching pale socks for 9 months. The sock against her fingers pulled, gently, the specific gentle pull of an invitation, of something asking rather than demanding, the differential pressure of warmth and wanting. Diana leaned forward into the porthole opening. The building shook, not literally. The building did not move, but Mrs. Aponte, 3 floors up, woke from a sleep she hadn't known she'd fallen into, and sat upright in her bed with the certainty that something in the building had shifted, that the thing in the basement had taken a step it wasn't supposed to take, that the rule had been not just broken, but abandoned. She got up. She put on her robe. She went downstairs. The laundry room door was warm to the touch. She opened it. The room looked normal. The 4 dryers, the 4 washers, the folding table, the fluorescent light. Everything in its expected configuration. Except the 3rd dryer from the left was open, the door standing outward, the porthole gaping, and the laundry basket that had been on the folding table was on the floor, and from inside the open drum a warmth was pouring out that was too thick, too body-warm, too intimate for a machine. Diana was not in the room. Mrs. Aponte looked in the drum. The drum contained 1 white sock folded. neatly placed at the centre of the drum's floor like an offering. The drum's interior metal was warm, not hot, not dangerous, but the persistent body warmth of a space that had held something living until very recently. The drum smelled of detergent and warmth, and something underneath both that Mrs. Aponte recognised and closed her eyes against. She stood with her hand on the open dryer door, and she listened to the building. The building was quiet. The vent above her exhaled, slow and full, the exhalation of something satisfied. Diana Chen came back to the building 3 days later. She arrived on a Thursday morning and let herself in with her key, and went up to her apartment and appeared, to the people who saw her in the hallway and the lobby, to be herself. She looked fine. She looked, some people said afterward, better than she had in months. There was colour in her face that hadn't been there, a warmth to her skin in the specific interior warmth of someone who was running. Well? She smiled at people she passed. She seemed, in the specific unquantifiable way that people seemed things, present. Here. Warm in a way that reached outward from her. She did her laundry in the building machines the following Wednesday. She stood at the dryer, third from the left, her usual one, and she loaded her clothes and she closed the door and the door latched with a single clean click. She started the machine, the drum turned, the clothes tumbled. She stood at the porthole and watched them, and her expression was impossible to read. And when the cycle finished, she took her clothes out and folded them on the table, with a neatness that was, if you watched, something more than practicality. It was the neatness of a person who had been given something, and was being careful with what they'd been given. She never talked about the 3 days. She never talked about what she'd seen through the open porthole, or what had been on the other side, or what the darkness inside the machine had felt like, or smelled like, or shown her. She did, eventually, talk to Mara. They had become the kind of friends that sometimes develops between people who share a building and a private knowledge of the same thing, the friendship of mutual witnesses. They had coffee twice a month and they talked around the edges of what they knew, and sometimes they talked about it directly. Diana said once, over coffee in December, that the 3 days she had been gone had felt like being very warm for a very long time. That warmth had been the primary quality of the experience, that she didn't want to describe what she'd seen or been shown because she didn't have the right words, and she wasn't sure the words existed, but that warm was the truest thing she could say. Mara asked if she was afraid. Diana thought about it for a long time. Then she said that afraid wasn't quite right either, that what she felt about the machine and what was in it was more like reverence, not the reverence you felt for something holy, which was reverence mixed with desire, but the reverence you felt for something very old and very powerful that had made clear it was more interested in you than it was interested in your well-being. The reverence of a small creature for something that was larger, that moved differently, that had its own economy in which you were a resource. She said she missed the warmth sometimes. She said she was working on what that meant. She said the sock that came back with her, the one she'd found in her basket after the 3 days, folded on top of her returned clothes, clean and white and precisely folded. She still had it. She kept it in a drawer. She didn't wear it. She kept it because it was, in some way she couldn't explain, a receipt. Evidence of a transaction that had occurred, a record of something exchanged. The sock, Mara did not say, was what Sock Hollow always returned, not what it took. What it took was the hope, the warmth, the feeling of the clean start. What it returned were pieces. The sock was a piece. The comfort came back in fragments, never whole, always slightly incomplete, always arriving with the quality of something that had been through a machine and come out functional but changed, like fabric that had been washed too many times, still serviceable, still warm when you wore it, with something subtly absent that you couldn't name without feeling the before. The before was what you lost when you said the words, not the hope itself. That came back, in a form. The comfort returned, in a form. But the form was different, and the difference was in the wholeness of it, the capacity of the returned warmth to be what it had been before it was fed into the machine and processed. The machine took something that was whole and returned it in pieces, and the pieces were warm and real and you could hold them, but they were pieces, and the seams where they'd been cut showed, and over time you came to understand that this was what the machine did. This was its specific operation. It consumed wholeness and returned fragments, and the fragments were warm, but they were not the same thing as what you'd had before you asked for it back. The building had 16 units. The Calvert building, standing since 1947, housing its successive populations in their warmth and proximity and need. The laundry room in the basement. The 4 dryers. The vent in the corner that breathed. The third machine from the left, with its porthole that fogged from the interior warmth, with its door that clicked like something adjusting alignment. Outside, the rain returned every few weeks, hitting the small laundry room window the way it always had, not dramatically, just persistently. The specific patient ticking of water against glass, the sound the world made when it was being thorough. Mrs. Aponte was the building's memory. She had been there since 1991, which meant she had been there long enough to have watched Sock Hollow grow from what she described in her private accounting as a presence into what it was now. In 1991, it had been a cold spot near the dryers, the feeling of being watched when you loaded the machine, the occasional missing sock. By 2000, it had graduated to the breathing vent and the pale figure in the porthole. By 2010, the door was clicking like teeth. By now, it had become, not larger exactly, but deeper, more fluent, more capable of the specific intimacy that required months of learning before it could speak. She had tried, over the years, to explain what she thought it was, and she had never found the language that was adequate. The best she had managed was ecological. It was what grew in a particular condition, sustained by a particular resource, following the logic of its own survival, with the indifference of any organism to the well-being of what it ate. It was not malicious. It was not cruel. It took what it needed from what was available, which was human, hope in the specific form it took in laundry rooms at 2 a.m, and it operated with the clean efficiency of something that had evolved specifically for this niche. What she thought, in the part of herself that she didn't usually articulate because articulation made things more fixed, and she preferred to leave this particular thing with its edges soft. What she thought was that Sock Hollow was not separate from the building in the way an organism was separate from its habitat. She thought it had grown into the building the way warmth grew into walls, pervasively, through every channel and gap and seam, until the machine and the vent and the pipes and the ductwork were not its habitat but its body. She thought that what you encountered in the laundry room was not Sock Hollow coming to find you, but rather the part of the building that was Sock Hollow making itself perceptible to you, the specific channel through which a much larger thing chose to interface with a much smaller thing. She thought the whole building breathed. She thought when the pipes knocked at night it was more complex than pipes expanding in temperature change. She thought the warmth in the corridors on cold evenings, the warmth that the building always held above what the heating system alone could account for, was the building's own, kept in its walls and floors the way the drum kept warmth between cycles. Not mechanical, not quite. Something more interior. She did not share this. She shared the rule, and she shared what she knew about the behaviour, and she shared the history in the specific limited doses that were useful, and she kept the larger thought to herself, under the category of things that were probably true but that were better held quietly than spoken into warm air where they might be heard. She kept her laundry done. She used the machines every Thursday morning. She placed one clean sock on top of the third machine from the left at the end of every load, folded and left, without ceremony, and she named one thing she couldn't fix today, and she did this with the consistency of someone who had long since moved past belief into something steadier. Habit. Respect. The maintenance of a relationship that was not equal but was, on her end, properly conducted. The machine's door always clicked cleanly after the sock was placed. One clean click. Metal finding its correct alignment. She had never said the words. She had been careful, over 34 years, never to say the words, never to stand at the open porthole and ask for return, never to reach toward the warmth in the dark behind the drum's eye and pull. She had accepted many things she couldn't fix, one per cycle, with the patient accumulation of someone who had been doing this longer than most people had been alive. She had lost things. She had put them down. She had left them on top of the machine and walked away and come back Thursday morning to find the machine as it always was, the sock gone, the drum warm, the vent breathing steadily, the porthole clear and reflecting only the room. She understood the transaction. She had been careful with it. She was careful with it now, in her 71 years, in her apartment that smelled of cooking and cats, and the particular human warmth of a space well lived in her body that had its own catalogue of things it couldn't fix tonight. She was careful with the knowledge, and she was careful with the rule, and she was careful, above all, with the building, which was older than she was, and which knew things she didn't know, and which had, in her 34 years of Thursday morning loads, never done her harm. This was the covenant. Not grand, not religious, not the stuff of stories that made themselves big in the telling, just the specific small covenant of a person who knew what the building contained and how to be in relation to it. Not fearless, not without awe, but careful. Properly careful. The way you were careful with old things, with powerful things, with things that operated on a scale and a timeline and an economy you couldn't fully comprehend. Outside, the rain. Inside, the warmth. The vent breathing. The drum keeping its heat between cycles. The pale sock somewhere in the building's deep infrastructure. turning slowly in a warm current that ran through the walls and the ducts and the pipes and the floors of the Calvert building, keeping itself oriented, keeping itself warm, waiting for the next late-night load, the next tired person descending with their basket and their hunger for reset, the next breath sinking to the vent, the next desperate whisper into the open porthole, the next taking, the next returning of fragments that were warm and real but no longer whole, no longer the thing they had been before they went in. The building breathed, the rain ticked, the machine waited. This was what Sock Hollow kept tumbling, long after the cycle ended and the door clicked shut and the tenant walked back down the damp hallway with clean clothes and a specific hollowness where the comfort had been. Not the socks, not the fabric, but the feeling. The feeling that a cycle could return what the day took. That warmth was recoverable, that the clean start you came for would arrive the way you needed it to. Whole, warm, finished. It didn't steal the socks, it stole the feeling that the socks would ever be warm enough, and it tumbled that feeling in its drum, slowly and without stopping, through every season, through every midnight load, through every late-night visit from someone who needed more than clean fabric, but came to the basement for it anyway, tumbling and reducing and keeping it down to something just small enough, just warm enough, to make you come back, to make you stand in the warmth and breathe and believe again, just a little, just for a moment, that this time, this cycle, this time, you would put it in and get it back whole, and when you reached for it, when you stood at the porthole and breathed and said the words that were always and only ever the same words, the simplest words, the most human words, the only words the machine needed, give it back, give it back, give it back. The door opened inward, the warmth came out, the building breathed, and what came back to you, eventually, in the basket you'd left on the folding table, clean and neatly folded and warm from the machine's long memory, what came back was a piece of what you'd had, warm enough to hold, not enough to fill the shape of what was missing, just enough to make you come back. The Calvert building stood on its corner as it had always stood, through the rain and the decades and the slow accumulation of warmth in its walls. It housed its tenants with the impersonal care of old structures, keeping them warm, keeping them dry, providing the infrastructure of daily life while remaining largely indifferent to the content of those lives. The laundry room hummed in the basement. The dryers ran their cycles. The vent breathed. Above the building, the city continued its operation, indifferent and enormous, its own economy of warmth and loss running through its millions of occupied spaces, each one a pocket of human heat against the enormous cold, each one running its own transactions of hope and disappointment, its own specific inventory of things that couldn't be fixed tonight. Some buildings held what they were given. The Calvert building held more than most. Maravos lived there for another 2 years before she moved to a larger place across the city, a place with its own in-unit washer and dryer that were purely mechanical and breathed only when the heating came on. She took Flemish with her. She called her friend and had the conversation they'd been needing to have. She went back to therapy, back to the specific every other Tuesday rhythm of working on things that couldn't be resolved in a cycle. She thought about her mother, with the directness that followed from having set the grief down on top of a machine at 10:30 on a Friday night in the basement of the Calvert building, and the thinking was still grief, but it was also memory, and it was also love, and it was, overall, less like drowning and more like standing in water. She thought about the dryer sometimes. She thought about the pale sock and the teeth click and the vent that had matched her breathing, and the warmth that had pressed against her face when she'd stood with her arms in the drum. She thought about what Mrs. Aponte had told her, and what Diana had said about warmth and pieces, and she thought she understood something about it now that she hadn't understood standing in the room, that what the machine had wanted from her, what it had been learning and cataloguing and preparing to consume, was the specific version of hope she'd carried that night, the hope that was really a form of grief, the hope that warmth and rotation and the domestic ritual of clean fabric could return what had been taken, that the machine could give back what October had taken, that something simple could substitute for something irreplaceable. She understood that the machine couldn't give that back, not because it wasn't powerful enough, but because nothing was powerful enough for that particular job. Nothing was powerful enough to make the world give back the things it took. What you could do, what the rule was trying to preserve your capacity to do, was put it down, not forever, just tonight, and then tomorrow night if needed, and then the next night. The accumulation of small acceptances that was not resignation, that was the actual structure of continuing to be alive in a world that took things. The sock she'd placed on the machine was a piece of that, a small clean offering that was also a practice at putting things down, at accepting the specific night's inventory of unfixable things, at leaving something behind, without demanding its return, She did this now without machines. She did it in the regular way, the way everyone did it without knowing that's what they were doing when it worked. By noticing what couldn't be fixed tonight, naming it, putting it down, and going to sleep. It was not dramatic. It was not sufficient. It required repetition, and it worked imperfectly. And some nights it didn't work at all, and she lay awake with everything she'd named and supposedly put down, sitting right on her chest like Flemish. But it worked, often enough. And the warmth that arrived when it worked, the actual warmth, the human warmth, the warmth of her own body having released something it had been holding, was whole, was hers, was not a fragment returned from something that consumed wholeness. It was the difference, she thought, between the warmth you borrowed and the warmth you kept. In the Calvert building, in the basement laundry room, the dryer ran. Someone was there at 2 a.m. There was always someone at 2 a.m. That was the thing about buildings that held warmth. They drew the specific visitors who needed it at the specific hours when the need was highest. The city outside was dark and wet, and the corridor outside the laundry room smelled of damp carpet, and the room itself was the warmest room in the building. The pocket of ambient heat that the machine and the vent and the accumulated warmth of 70 years of late-night cycles had generated and maintained. Someone stood at the porthole, watching their clothes tumble, feeling the warmth against their face, believing, the way you couldn't help but believe, standing in the warmth with the rain outside and the machine turning, that this would be the cycle that returned it, whatever it was. The thing the day had taken, or the thing the year had taken, or the thing the decade had taken, or the thing that had been taken so long ago, it had no specific date, only its absence, only the shape of where it had been, only the warmth you were looking for in a basement machine at 2 a.m. The vent breathed, the porthole fogged, a pale sock appeared. Outside the rain persisted, ticking against the glass. Inside the warmth kept itself, and the machine waited for the words, which always came, which always came, which always eventually came. Because the words were easy. The words were the easiest thing in the world, in the warmth, at 2 a.m, with the day still on you and the grief still in you and the faith still available. The specific faith that something warm could return what was cold, that a cycle could close a wound that was not a fabric wound, that the machine could give back what only the machine could see you were missing. The easiest thing in the world was to lean close to the porthole, close enough to feel the heat on your cheek, close enough to see your own breath fog the glass and say the words, "Give it back, give it back, give it back." The door opens. The warmth comes out. The building breathes. And Sock Hollow keeps tumbling in the dark behind the drum's eye, patient and warm and old as the building's bones, with everything it's been given, turning it slowly, reducing it carefully, keeping it just warm enough to be felt, just whole enough to be wanted, just out of reach enough to keep you reaching, turning and turning and turning, the way the drum turned, the way the earth turned, the way all things turned that were warm in the centre, and patient in their waiting, turning with the slow persistence of something that understood, better than the people who fed it, that what you came to recover could not be recovered, that what you came to clean was not dirty, that what you came to warm had gone cold in a place the machine's heat couldn't reach. Turning, in the dark, warm, waiting. The rain kept on. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Rain had been falling since before she woke up, and it would go on falling long after she stopped noticing it. That was the nature of rain in this city, in this building, in this particular apartment on the 4th floor, where the windows faced a brick wall, and the light came in grey and thin as old paper. The rain didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with thunder or the cinematic sweep of weather moving across open country. It simply appeared, the way certain kinds of sadness appear, not sudden, not dramatic, just present, as if it had always been there, and you'd only just now turned your attention to it. Mara had been awake since 4 a.m. She knew this not because she'd looked at the clock, but because 4 a.m. was when she always woke up, had always woken up, ever since the move, ever since the autumn had shifted into something harder and less forgiving than the autumn she'd been promised by this city when she'd first arrived in September with boxes and optimism and the particular kind of naivety that looks, from the inside, exactly like courage. She lay still for a long time, which was also a habit by now, this lying still, this waiting for the ceiling to offer her something, some instruction, some reassurance, some small proof that the day was worth beginning. The ceiling offered nothing, as ceilings do. The heater clicked on. It was an old radiator, cast iron, painted over so many times the surface had gone bumpy and indistinct, and when the heat came on it expanded with a series of small metallic sounds, ticks and pops and one low, mournful clunk that always came at the end, like punctuation. She had learned to find the sound comforting, which she recognised as a mild form of desperation, finding comfort in the involuntary protests of metal infrastructure. But comfort was comfort, and you took it where it lived. She lay in the made bed. She always made the bed. Always. Even on mornings she never got out of it, she made it. Around herself, which she understood was not quite sane, but which also felt non-negotiable. The way some deeply embedded habits feel not like choices, but like load-bearing structures. The sheets were white. The blanket was the colour of old moss, thick and dense. Woven in a pattern she'd traced with her fingers so many times she could have drawn it from memory. Interlocking rectangles, each one nested inside the next, all the way to the centre where they converged at a tight, nearly invisible point. She'd bought the blanket at a shop that was already closing when she found it. The kind of shop that sells things you didn't know you needed, heavy things, handmade things, things without obvious origin. The woman behind the counter had been old and specific in the way that very old people sometimes are, specific about small details in ways that felt disproportionate. She'd folded the blanket into a particular shape before handing it over, a precise flat fold that Mara had photographed with. A phone because she wasn't sure she could replicate it, though she never looked at the photograph again because she never needed to. She always folded the blanket the same way. Her hands seemed to know. The rain came down, the heater clicked. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing, which was not the same as feeling peaceful. It was more like standing in a room after all the furniture has been removed and realising the room is larger than you thought, and that the largeness is not a comfort but an exposure. She had moved to this city for a job that no longer existed, having been restructured out of existence 6 weeks after her arrival, and she was still here because she'd signed a lease, and because the cost of leaving felt, in some accounting she couldn't quite articulate, higher than the cost of staying. She had savings that were being spent with a slow, steady precision, like sand leaving an hourglass, and she had interviews that didn't become jobs, and she had the apartment and the view of the brick wall and the rain and the heater and the blanket, and she had, in the deepest and most honest part of herself, a growing suspicion that she had made a series of decisions whose consequences she didn't yet fully understand, and that the understanding, when it came, was going to be difficult. She hadn't told anyone this. This was the part she hadn't told anyone. She was 31. She had friends who were, in the easy parlance of the age, killing it. Promotions, partnerships, children born into apartments with more than one bedroom, vacations photographed and disseminated. The whole architecture of a life that cohered, that added up, that made sense from the outside, and presumably she chose to believe from the inside as well. She had a phone full of their evidence. She looked at it less than she used to. She was aware that this was also not a great sign. She smoothed the blanket across her chest and watched the way the fabric lay against her body and thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost architectural about a well-made bed. The structure of it, the way the corners tucked and held, the way the whole surface could be pulled taut and flat, eliminating wrinkles, presenting something clean and resolved, even when the person inside it was neither of those things. The blanket was, she knew, too heavy for October. She had looked at it several times in the past weeks and thought she should switch to something lighter. The duvet was in the closet, practically speaking it made more sense, but she kept using the blanket, kept pulling it up around her shoulders, kept finding it under her hands when she woke at 4 in the morning and needed something to hold on to that was real and present and heavy and there. It was the heaviness she needed, the weight of it across her body. She understood that this was the blanket doing something for her that the blanket could not technically be responsible for, but she found that she didn't care about the category error. The blanket felt like something, and feeling like something was enough. Outside the window, the rain continued its patient erasure of the world. She could hear it on the glass and on the metal lip of the air conditioner she hadn't removed yet. Though it was October, and the air conditioner served no purpose now except to collect rain and block a slice of the already insufficient light. She kept meaning to take it out. She kept not taking it out. This was, she acknowledged, a pattern. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up with her, and lay there looking at the wall, which was white and blank, and thought about whether she was going to get up today. She thought about this in a practical, logistical way, the way you think about whether to make a phone call you've been avoiding. The day was out there. It would require things of her. Coffee first, and then the particular performance of personhood that each day demanded, the checking of emails, the updating of applications, the maintenance of the fiction, that everything was proceeding normally, that she was a person with momentum and direction, and not a person who lay in a made bed at 4 in the morning waiting for the ceiling to say something. The heater clicked again, the low clunk at the end of its cycle, and the room settled back into the particular thick silence that rain creates. that sense of the world having been slightly muffled, sound arriving wrapped in something soft. She liked this silence, which she also understood was a problem, or at least a symptom. You weren't supposed to like silence this much. You were supposed to want the noise of people, the clatter of being alive in proximity to other alive things. She had wanted that once. She could remember wanting it. The wanting felt, at this distance, like something she'd read about rather than experienced. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She hovered in that country just south of sleep, where the body relaxes but the mind continues its small obsessive circuits. She thought about the interview she had on Thursday, the third-round interview at the company whose product she didn't entirely understand, but whose salary would resolve for a while the sand in the hourglass problem. She thought about her mother, who called on Sundays and to whom she said reliably that everything was fine. She thought about a person she used to know, whose face arrived in her mind at these early morning hours with an uninvited regularity that she had mostly stopped arguing with. She thought about the grocery list she'd written on a notepad and then left on the kitchen counter and then covered with a coffee cup and then forgotten about, probably. She thought about the way the blanket felt. This was when she noticed it. The top edge of the blanket had moved. She opened her eyes. She was lying on her side, facing the wall, and the blanket was over her, heavy and present, and the top edge, the fold she'd turned down when she got into bed, that neat 2-inch cuff of moss-green fabric, was higher than it had been. Not much. An inch, maybe 2. Folded against itself in a crisp, nearly geometric line that she was certain she'd not created. She stared at it. Her immediate instinct was that she'd done it herself, in that hovering semi-sleep, some restless adjustment she hadn't consciously noticed. This was the rational explanation, and she held on to it for a moment, testing its weight, finding it adequate. She had moved the blanket. She had done it without noticing. This was not interesting or strange. She turned back over, facing the ceiling again, and lay flat, and the blanket lay flat with her, and she could see the top edge from this angle, the neat fold, and she told herself that she was about to get up. She was about to get up and make coffee and be a person, and the day was going to proceed in the normal way, rain and all. The heater clicked on. She was watching the top edge of the blanket when it moved. It was a small movement, the kind of movement that, if you weren't watching, you would absolutely miss, and if you were watching, you would spend a considerable amount of time trying to explain away. The fold tightened. Not dramatically, not with any violence or speed, but with a slow, deliberate precision, the fabric contracting by perhaps half an inch, the crease sharpening as if someone were pressing it flat with a thumb, making it more exact, more finished, more like a thing that had been carefully, intentionally done. Mara sat up. She sat up fast, the blanket sliding down to her waist, and she sat there in the dim rainlight and looked at the top of the blanket, and her heart was doing something she would describe, if pressed, as heightened. Not pounding, nothing so dramatic, just elevated, running a little fast, the way a heart runs when the body receives ambiguous information and is waiting for clarification. She pulled the blanket down, all the way down, off her body, off the bed, letting it fall in a heap at the foot. She sat looking at it. It was a blanket. It lay in a heap the way blankets lie in heaps, formless and inert, a pile of woven fibre on the end of a bed. It was not doing anything. It was not moving. It was a blanket. She got up. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, which faced not the brick wall but the small interior courtyard, and watched the rain collect in the gutter that ran along the roof of the first-floor extension and overflow into a thin sheet that fell past the window in a moving, irregular curtain. She held the coffee with both hands. The coffee was hot and real and present, and she was grateful for its uncomplicated realness, its absolute commitment to being exactly and only what it was. She drank half of it standing up, and the other half sitting at the kitchen table with her phone, going through emails she didn't need to answer yet. By 8:30, she had convinced herself, almost entirely, that she had imagined it. This was not, she recognised, a completely satisfying conclusion. To imagine that a blanket moved was a notable enough event to warrant some investigation. She was a person of, she felt, reasonable psychological stability. She slept poorly, yes. She was under stress, yes, the specific and grinding stress of financial precariousness, in a city that offered no quarter to the financially precarious. She was lonely, which she thought but did not say, not to her mother on Sundays, not to the friends she texted with declining frequency. But none of these things, individually or together, seemed to her like sufficient explanation for a waking hallucination involving bedding. Still, the alternative was not one she was prepared to entertain before 9 in the morning. She made toast. She answered 2 emails. She opened the window a crack to let in the smell of the rain, which was one of her consistent small pleasures, the metallic greenness of wet city air, and she stood there breathing it in and felt for a moment something like okayness, which was the best she was reliably achieving these days. Okayness, the absence of acute distress. She was familiar with this territory and had made a kind of home in it. The day proceeded. She went out in the rain with an umbrella that only half worked, the kind of umbrella that is fine in vertical rain but has opinions about wind, and she walked to the library because the library was free and warm and full of people who also, by their presence at 11 on a Tuesday, had some complicated relationship with the standard architecture of a productive day. She sat at a table near a window and read a novel she'd checked out 3 weeks ago, and was only now getting to, a novel about a family in a house, which was a novel about many things, and she read for 2 hours, and the reading felt like the best thing she'd done in recent memory, which was also not a great sign, but which she was choosing today not to dwell on. She came home at 2, she heated soup, she applied for a job she thought she probably wasn't qualified for, but which she was applying for anyway, on the principle that you did not know what you did not know, and it cost nothing but the hour it took to tailor the application. She watched part of a documentary about deep-sea creatures she'd seen before, and which she found always soothing, in the particular way that very alien things can be soothing. Their complete indifference to her existence, their beautiful, purposeful strangeness, the fact that they had evolved over millions of years in the dark and were doing fine. By 8 in the evening she was tired in the bone-level way that had become her default, the exhaustion that wasn't quite physical but wasn't quite mental either, the exhaustion of managing, of the daily project of being okay, of carrying the particular weight of a life that was not yet what she'd thought it would be. She made the bed. This was part of it, the evening making. She'd done it so long she couldn't remember starting. She remade the bed before getting into it, smoothing the sheets, pulling them taut, tucking the corners, then the blanket over the top, pulled up and turned down in that 2-inch cuff. She stood back and looked at it. It looked right. It looked the way a bed should look, clean and tight and ready. She brushed her teeth. She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the lamp on the nightstand which threw the room into warm amber shadow. She changed into the grey t-shirt and sweatpants she slept in. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room for a moment. The rain still at the windows, softer now, the heater beginning its evening cycle of clicks, the lamp making the shadows of things long and gentle. And then she lifted the blanket and got inside and settled down and reached up and turned off the lamp. Dark, rain, the heaters, patient percussion. She lay still. For perhaps 20 minutes she lay still, not sleeping, not thinking in any focused way, letting her mind drift through the shallow water of not quite sleep, and the room was warm and the blanket was heavy and she supposed, as comfortable as she was going to get. She thought about the interview Thursday. She thought about the documentary and the creatures in the dark water with their own light. She thought about nothing. Then she felt the blanket move. Not a dramatic movement, not a lurch or a tug. The same small, incremental creep she'd noticed in the early morning. The top edge tightening, the fold sharpening, gaining perhaps an inch of altitude in the slow, unhurried way of something that does not need to hurry. She felt it against her collarbone, the slight increase in pressure, the edge of the fold pressing more precisely against her skin. She turned on the lamp. The blanket lay flat across her. The top edge was folded back in exactly. The 2-inch cuff she'd turned down when she made the bed. It looked undisturbed. It looked fine. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart doing its elevated thing again, and she reached up and pulled the fold down deliberately, making the cuff 3 inches instead of 2 just to change it, just to establish a new position she would recognise. She turned off the lamp. 20 minutes later, maybe less, the fold had returned to exactly 2 inches. She felt it happen, felt the fabric shift against her chin, the edge creeping up with the slow certainty of something patient, something that was not hurrying because it did not need to hurry, because it knew, with whatever form of knowing belonged to it, that there was no urgency, that she wasn't going anywhere, that the night was long and she was in it. She turned the lamp on again and sat up and looked at the blanket, and the blanket lay there, still and dense and the colour of old moss, and the top edge was in exactly the right place, exactly as she would have made it, the crease sharp and neat and perfect. She got out of bed and went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water, and stood at the sink for a while, and then she went back to the bedroom and sat in the chair in the corner. There was a small chair in the corner. She'd had it in every apartment she'd ever lived in, an old wooden chair with a cushion she'd recovered twice now, and she sat in the chair, and she looked at the bed, and the bed sat there, being a bed, which was, she reminded herself, what it was. The bed, sheets and a blanket and a mattress. There was nothing here. She was tired and stressed and sleeping poorly, and her mind was apparently generating experiences that bore some examination. She sat in the chair for perhaps an hour. The rain had quieted. The heater clicked through its cycles. The bed didn't do anything. Eventually she got back in it. She lay there with the light on for a while, watching the blanket with the particular wary attention of someone who's not quite sure what they're looking for but is very sure they'll know it when they see it. Nothing happened. The blanket lay flat and heavy and still. The rain was barely audible now. She turned the light off. Sleep came, finally, the way it came on bad nights. Not as a welcome thing, but as a surrender. The body simply refusing the mind's continued insistence on wakefulness. Consciousness going out not with the usual soft fade, but with something more abrupt, like a door closing. She woke at 4. The heater was clicking. The rain had resumed, or perhaps it had never stopped, merely quieted past the threshold of her sleeping awareness. She was on her back, which she rarely was. She was a side sleeper, always had been. And the blanket was pulled up to her chin, which was higher than she would have put it. She was warm, too warm almost, and the fold was there at her chin, that neat 2-inch cuff, precise and sharply creased. And when she lay still for a moment she was almost certain she could feel the way the fabric held itself, not loose the way a blanket goes loose when it's simply lying over a body, but somehow deliberate, somehow structured, as if it had arranged itself with a purpose. She pulled the blanket down to her waist. Within 10 minutes it was back at her chin. She didn't see it move. She lay there watching, and she didn't see it move, but each time she pulled it down it crept back up, incrementally, in the dark, in the rain. Slow silence of 4 in the morning, and each time she checked it had returned to its preferred position, and the crease was sharp and the fold was exact, and the blanket lay across her with the patient, precise certainty of something that had decided where it wanted to be. She got up and turned on all the lights and sat in the kitchen until morning. This is the point at which a different person might have called someone, a friend, a family member, a person whose voice coming through a phone could establish by its familiar ordinariness that the world was still the world. Mara thought about calling. She thought about what she would say. She imagined the call, the explanation, the pauses on the other end, the careful tone that would emerge, the tone that is not quite concern and not quite dismissal, but something in between, the tone that says I love you, and also I'm not sure what you're asking me to do with this information. She decided not to call. She was not, she told herself, going to be a person who called someone because her blanket moved in the night. By morning she had 3 competing theories, which she'd been developing since approximately 5 a.m, with the focused attention of someone who needs a problem to solve. Theory 1 was that she was imagining it, that the stress and the sleeplessness and the general weight of the past months had produced a hypnagogic experience that felt more real than such experiences usually feel, a waking, hallucination triggered by some combination of anxiety and sleep deprivation, and the particular quality of attention she was now directing at the blanket, which might itself be intensifying the experience, the observer effect, the way watching for something can make you see it. Theory 2 was that there was a structural explanation she wasn't seeing, that some property of the blanket's weave, or the way heat moved through the room, or some quality of the way she was sleeping, was causing the blanket to shift in ways that felt intentional but weren't. That were the result of physics rather than anything else. Theory 3 she did not linger on. She pulled the blanket off the bed and put it in the closet and used the duvet. The duvet was fine. It was lighter, less substantial. It didn't have the weight she'd come to associate with sleeping, but it was fine. She slept with the duvet for 3 nights, and the duvet did not move, and she slept adequately, not well, but adequately, and by Thursday she felt almost normal enough to go to the 3rd round interview and present herself as a competent and enthusiastic professional who was exactly the right person for this role. And she felt, leaving the interview, that it had gone well, that she had been both coherent and personable, and she rewarded herself with coffee from the place on the corner that charged too much, but whose coffee was, in her experience, worth it. She was in a reasonable mood when she got home. The rain had stopped for the first time in what felt like weeks. There was actual late afternoon light coming through the window, pale and thin but present, and she stood in it for a while and felt the particular small elation of light after extended darkness, which is one of the body's most reliable small pleasures and requires nothing of you except the capacity to notice it. She made dinner. She called her mother and said, as she always said, that things were going well. She meant it more than she usually did. She watched the first episode of something that had been recommended to her and which seemed promising. She went to bed feeling for the first time in a while as though she was a person with some forward motion. She forgot about the blanket. This is to say, she didn't think about it when she got ready for bed. didn't think about it when she turned down the sheets, and so, because the body remembers what the mind has decided not to, she reached into the closet for it without consciously deciding to. She recognised what she was doing partway through pulling it from the closet. She stood there with it in her hands, heavy and moss green, and she thought, no, she thought, I should put this back. She thought these things clearly and with conviction, and then she unfolded it and spread it over the bed. It felt right. It felt the way the bed was supposed to feel. She got in. She smoothed the top edge down into its cuff. She turned off the light. The heater clicked. Outside, the car went past, the first traffic sound she'd heard in hours, and she listened to it until it was gone. She'd been lying there for perhaps 15 minutes when she felt the warmth begin to change. It's difficult to describe precisely. The warmth under the blanket had, until now, been the ordinary warmth of a body in a bed. Her warmth, emanating from her and trapped by the fabric, reaching an equilibrium. But this warmth was doing something different. It was becoming, she would think later, too warm. Not in the way of a fever, not the burning wet heat of illness, but something more even and encompassing. Warmth that seemed to come from the fabric itself rather than from her. Warmth that was, somehow, more present than warmth usually was, more there. And the sound was different. She noticed this because she was the kind of person who, when lying awake, catalogued the sounds around her. The rain she knew, and the heater she knew, and the traffic and the distant plumbing of the building. The pipes moving water through floors and walls on its way to wherever it went. These were familiar, and she heard them as a kind of score, ambient, uninteresting. But now the sound felt closer. Or rather, the sound felt normal, but her perception of it felt contained, as if she were hearing the world from inside something, as if the blanket were not just covering her but enclosing her, creating an acoustic space that was just slightly smaller than the room. She opened her eyes. The room was dark except for the thin line of streetlight that came under the curtain and lay across the floor in a pale stripe. She could see the ceiling, barely. She could see the outline of the window. She could see her own hands resting on top of the blanket, dimly visible. The blanket's surface looked different. She lay still and stared at it. The weave, she had traced the weave of this blanket 1,000 times, knew its interlocking rectangles, the pattern converging at the centre. The weave had lines in it now, subtle, barely there, visible only in this particular darkness where the eye was grasping for information, but lines. Not the pattern of the weave. These were different. They ran along the folds and the edges, following the contours of where the blanket lay over her body, and they had the look. She lay very still and looked at this carefully, wanting to be sure. They had the look of stitching, of deliberate marking, as if someone had taken thread the same colour as the fabric, barely distinguishable, and stitched a series of lines that traced the shape of something. That traced, she realised, her shape. She sat up. She turned the light on. The blanket lay across her, and the surface was the surface she knew, interlocking rectangles, the same weave, the centre point. Nothing extra, no lines, no stitching. She ran her hand over the fabric and felt nothing but the fabric, nubby and dense, the feel she associated with the word blanket, with the concept of warmth and covering and the comfort of weight. She turned the light off, lay back, waited. In the dark, within a few minutes, the lines returned. They were faint. They were the colour of the fabric itself, made slightly different. They required the dark and the reaching eye to appear, but they were there, and they were, she was increasingly certain, in the shape of a body. Her body, or a body her size, outlined in the precise and unhurried way of something that was measuring, that was making a pattern, that was determining the exact dimensions of the space she occupied. The heater clicked. The warmth deepened. The fold at the top edge began its slow, patient creep. She said, out loud, to the room, and the rain, and the ceiling, and the blanket, and whatever else was in the room that was not any of these things, stop. The fold stopped. For a moment, or what felt like a moment, everything held. The warmth, the lines, the slow creep, all of it suspended, waiting, as if it had heard. Her. Then the fold continued. She got out of bed. She did not take the blanket off. She simply stood beside the bed in the dark and looked at it lying there, and the fold continued its creep, incrementally, half an inch at a time, in the direction of where her chin would have been, and the lines in the fabric were visible even from where she stood. The traced shape of a body in a bed, her outline, her presence recorded in thread. She stood there for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She reached out and took the top edge of the blanket in both hands, and she unfolded it, pulled it fully down, made the fold flat, eliminated the cuff. One clean motion. She stood there holding the straightened edge and she felt, there is no other word for it, she felt the resistance, not physical resistance, not the sensation of something pulling back against her hands, but something more like the feeling you get when you're the first person to walk across a room that's been arranged a particular way, when your movement through it unders something that was waiting to be undone. A change in the quality of the air, a sense of attention. The lines in the fabric faded. She stood holding the edge for another moment, and then she said, not loudly, not performatively, just as a fact spoken into the room, "I'm scared about Thursday." It felt absurd. It felt like talking to furniture. But she said it to the blanket, to the room, to herself. Because it was true. Because she hadn't said it to anyone. Because she had been carrying it for 3 days in the place where you carry things you don't acknowledge. The place that aches. "I'm scared they're going to say no," she said. "I'm scared it's going to be like all the others." The room was silent. The rain was barely there. A suggestion of rain. The heater had reached the end of its cycle and sat quiet. She stood by the bed holding the edge of the blanket and her chest hurt a little, the way it hurts when you put something down you've been carrying without noticing. She let go of the edge. She got back into bed. The blanket was still. The warmth was ordinary warmth. Her warmth. The unremarkable heat of a body in bed. The lines were gone. The fold stayed where she'd left it. She lay in the dark and the rain came and went and the heater clicked and she realised, not comfortable exactly, but okay. Not hiding, not buried. Present in the bed instead of tucked away in it. She slept. In the morning she felt the particular quality of attention that sleep sometimes grants, the way a night of actual sleep can make the previous day look different. Its shadows moved, its objects in new relation. She made coffee and stood in the kitchen and thought about what had happened and thought about what she knew and didn't know, which was considerable and almost nothing respectively. And she thought about the blanket. She thought about the woman in the closing shop, the specific fold, photographed and then never looked at again. The weight of the thing when she'd first picked it up, the way it felt heavier than it should, the way the woman had said, in the particular way of very old specific people, take good care of it. She thought about what she'd said the night before. She thought about the resistance she'd felt when she unfolded the edge. She thought, I'm going to do that again tonight. Whatever that was, the sitting up, the unfolding, the naming of the thing I'm not going to tuck away, and I'm going to do that again. The interview result came Friday morning. An email, polite and thorough, with the word unfortunately placed in the third sentence, after 2 sentences of genuine-sounding praise. She read it sitting on the edge of the made bed and felt the bottom of her stomach move in the familiar way it moved when she received these emails. The lurch, that never quite became nausea but that always threatened to. She read it twice. She put the phone down on the nightstand and she sat there for a while looking at the wall. The blanket was on the bed, made flat and smooth, the top edge turned down in its cuff. She hadn't gotten under it yet. She was still dressed. It was 9 a.m. She'd been awake since the phone lit up with the email notification, and she sat on the edge of it and looked at the wall, and the familiar thoughts began to assemble themselves. The familiar architecture of failure, which she knew well, had mapped extensively, could navigate in the dark. The question of what she'd done wrong, the inventory of her deficiencies, the prospect of telling people, the accumulated weight of time and money and moved boxes and signed leases, and the particular cruelty of hope, which is that it makes the alternative worse by contrast. She sat with these thoughts. She noticed the way they moved through her. Then she lay back on top of the made bed, fully dressed, and pulled the blanket over herself from the side. Within minutes, she felt it begin. The warmth deepening, the fold tightening, the lines forming in the weave, faint as intention, precise as measurement. She lay very still and felt the blanket learning her shape, the edge creeping up toward her chin with its patient incremental certainty. The room was warm. The rain was at the windows. The heater ticked its distant footsteps. She waited until the fold was at her chin, and then she sat up. She sat up, and she gripped the edge of the blanket with both hands, and she unfolded it, one full motion, pulling the fold flat, and she felt again that sense of resistance, of something interrupted, and the lines in the fabric dimmed, and then she held the edge and said to the room and the rain and herself, I didn't get the job. Her voice was steady. She had been afraid it wouldn't be. I didn't get the job, and I'm scared I'm not going to be okay. The room sat with this. I'm lonely, she said. I've been lonely for months and I haven't told anyone, and I'm telling. The blanket, which is insane, but I'm telling the blanket, and it's true. I'm lonely and I'm scared and I don't know how to fix this yet. The last word surprised her. Yet. She hadn't planned it. It arrived on its own, attached to the end of the sentence like something that had been waiting there. patient as the rain. She let go of the edge. She lay back down. The blanket was still. Ordinary warmth, no creeping, no lines. She lay on top of it with her shoes still on, the ceiling above her in its usual blank arrangement, and she breathed. After a while she thought, I have to make some calls. Not to say everything, not to perform crisis, not to lay herself open in the way that requires other people to manage their reaction to you and therefore puts you in the position of managing their management, which is the worst kind of exhausting. But to say something real to someone, to pick up the phone and say, it's not going well, to give someone the information they needed to be actually helpful rather than performatively supportive. She thought about which friend to call and which of her friendships were currently structured in a way that could hold this, and she thought, genuinely, I need to think about this carefully, which was itself a change from the not calling, the radio silence, the fine on Sundays. She took her shoes off without sitting up, reached down and undid the laces by feel, dropped them on the floor. She lay in her socks on the made bed with the blanket covering her, and the rain at the windows, and she felt, underneath the very real and present pain of the email, a small, specific clarity that she didn't want to use the word peace for, but that was in the vicinity of peace. Something had been put down, not solved, not resolved, but put down. She did not say, just let me disappear. She had felt the sentence come to her earlier, in the first minutes of lying there while the blanket was doing its thing, the sentence arriving with the ease of something that had been waiting. Just let me vanish. Just let me go. Just fold me away. And she had felt the appeal of it, the terrible seductive relief of it, the idea of being tucked so completely into warmth and structure that the world outside the bed could not reach her, and she would not be required to reach back. She had felt how easy it would be to say it, to give the blanket permission. She had not said it. She had sat up instead and unfolded the edge and told the truth, and the truth had made the room change in a way she couldn't explain and didn't try to. The days that followed were not better exactly. The job situation did not resolve. She sent more applications. She had 2 more interviews that didn't result in the next round. She called 2 friends on 2 different evenings and said the things she'd been not saying, and one of the conversations was hard and good, and one was harder than she'd expected, but still, ultimately, good, and both of them ended with the other person saying you should have told me sooner, which she knew, and which she found she could receive without going too deep into the self-recrimination because she had, she reminded herself, told them now. She talked to her mother on Sunday and said it was complicated. Her mother, who was not a complicated person, but who had raised a complicated person, and had therefore developed, over decades, a tolerance for complication, said, complicated how? And Mara told her, not everything, but enough. The move and the restructuring and the interviews and the months of managing it alone and the way the aloneness had gone from something she could carry to something she was disappearing under. She sat on the edge of the made bed with the phone pressed to her ear, and she talked for longer than she'd talked on a Sunday in years, and her mother listened and said the things mothers say and a few things that were better than that, more specific, more earned. And at the end of the call, her mother said, I'm coming to visit next month, and Mara said, yes, okay, and meant it. She put the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet. The rain had not come back. It had been a clear week, improbably clear for October running into November, and the light through the window was the low gold of late autumn, a particular quality of light that slants rather than falls, that finds the dust in the air and illuminates it, that makes everything look temporary and beautiful in the same gesture. She sat in this light and thought about her mother coming, and thought about the conversation she'd had, and thought about the application she was going to send tomorrow, the one she thought she was actually qualified for, the one where the job description read like something she could write herself. She turned and looked at the blanket. It lay on the bed in its smooth, flat arrangement, the top edge turned down in its 2-inch cuff, the moss-green surface with its interlocking pattern undisturbed. It was, she thought, just a blanket. She knew, she believed she knew, that it was just a blanket, that what she had experienced over the previous weeks was something happening at the intersection of the blanket and herself, something that had required her particular combination of stress and isolation and avoidance to occur, something that fed, if you wanted to put it that way, on the specific quality of disappearance she had been practicing. She also thought, but it moved. She held both of these thoughts. The truth was probably both. The truth was probably that there was something about the blanket, its age, its weight, its origin in that closing shop in the hands of a very old specific woman, and something about her, her state, her practice disappearing, the way she had been using the bed as a hiding place rather than a resting place. and that these two things had found each other in the dark of 4 a.m. and created an experience that was real, that had happened, that she could not entirely explain, and that had also, through whatever mechanism, pushed her toward doing something she needed to do. She smoothed her hand over the blanket. It was warm. It was just warm, the ordinary warmth of something that has been sitting in a room at room temperature. It was heavy in the way she knew, dense and substantial. She pressed her palm flat against the surface and left it there for a moment. Nothing happened. She said, to herself, or to the blanket, or to the room, "Thank you for the wake-up call." Then she stood up and went to the kitchen and started making dinner, and the late afternoon light came through the kitchen window at its slanted angle, and found the steam rising from the pot and illuminated it. And she watched the steam in the light and thought about eating, and thought about tomorrow, and thought about the application she was going to send, and thought, quite simply and without drama, I am here, I am still here, I am not in the blanket. I am in the kitchen, and the light is doing that thing with the steam, and I'm going to eat something, and then I am going to sleep, and in the morning I am going to keep going. The heater clicked on. The pipes moved water through the building. Somewhere in the apartment block someone was cooking something that smelled of onions and warmth and life going on. She stirred the pot. She set the table. She sat down. Outside the window, the last of the autumn light moved across the sky, and the first stars appeared, barely visible through the ambient glow of the city, but there. Now consider what Blanket Writhe knew, which was not nothing. It had been in the building since before the building was the building, since the site held something else, since the land was different, and the people on it were different, and the quality of their disappearing was different, but the disappearing itself was the same, because that is a constant, across times and architectures and the different forms, that lives take. People have always had the wish to be tucked away. People have always had the impulse to find the warmest, smallest space and fold into it, until the world stops requiring things of them. This is not pathology. This is biology. The body knows that rest is survival. The mind, which is not always wise but is always inventive, finds its own versions of the cave, the burrow, the nest. Blanket Writhe understood this, in whatever way it understood things, which was not the way of cognition or intention, but the way of a thing that has existed so long in the presence of a particular human impulse that it has become, in some fundamental way, continuous with it. It did not plan. It did not want. What it did was more like respond, a resonance, a tuning, the way a string vibrates in response to its matching frequency. When someone tucked themselves into bed with the quality of disappearance rather than rest, with the specific gravity of avoidance rather than the ordinary weight of tiredness, it felt it, and it responded by offering more of what was being sought. It was in this sense not malicious, it was generous, it gave you what you wanted. This was the problem. The old woman in the closing shop had known something about this. She was not precisely a person who knew old things. She was a person who had been around long enough that the things she'd seen had settled into her the way sediment settles, and she had developed, not through study but through accumulated exposure, an understanding of the nature of certain objects that exist at the boundary between the useful and the perilous. The blanket was one of these. It was not haunted in the way of ghost stories, not occupied by a specific personality with a specific grievance. It was more like a surface that had been, over time, sensitized, a surface that had absorbed the quality of all the disappearing that had happened in its presence, all the people who had pulled it up and pressed their face into its warmth and wished, with varying degrees of sincerity, to be gone. She had sold it to Mara because Mara had come in at the right time, which is to say at a moment of need, and because the blanket sometimes needed someone who was almost gone enough to feel it, but not yet gone enough to be lost to it. The old woman had various theories about this, all of which were too specific and too strange to have been arrived at without some history. She did not always explain these theories. She almost never sold the blanket. She had told Mara, take good care of it. She had meant, in part, take care of yourself with it. She had meant, the blanket will show you something about where you are, and whether that showing helps or harms depends on whether you're willing to look at what it shows. She had meant, don't say the sentence. She had not said all of this, because some things, said plainly, produce the opposite of their intended effect. The warned person becomes fixated, becomes curious, begins the very experiment they were warned against. So she had said, take good care of it, and she had folded it in a way that Mara's hands remembered without the mind's involvement, and she had hoped for the best, which is, in the end, what all of us do. The people in the building talked about Blanket Writhe the way they talked about drafts, casually, the way you talk about things you can't entirely explain but that have entered the lexicon, that have become part of how a place understands itself. The fourth floor in particular had a reputation, which was vague enough to mean nothing specific but persistent enough to mean something. People on the 4th floor slept heavily. People on the 4th floor had a tendency to stay in. The woman in 4B had not been seen at the mailboxes for 6 weeks once, and when she finally appeared she had a distant quality, the quality of someone returning from a long way away, and she'd moved out the following month without saying much to anyone. The man in 4D used to play guitar in the evenings, and then he stopped, and when someone asked he said he just didn't feel like it anymore, said it with a vague content that was more unsettling than complaint would have been. None of these things were necessarily Blanket Writhe. All of them might have been. Mara was in 4A, which had not had a long-term tenant in several years. The previous occupant, an older man who'd been a librarian for most of his working life, and who spent his retirement mostly reading, had simply become less and less visible, less and less present in the world. His mail piling up for 2 weeks before the super checked on him, and found him in the bed, not dead. This is important. This is part of how it works. Not dead, but deeply asleep. More deeply asleep than sleep. Asleep in the way of someone who has been tucked away with such completeness and such comfort that the body has simply continued in that direction, the most comfortable direction, the direction of not having to wake up. He'd been taken to the hospital, where he'd woken after a day and a half and been entirely unable to explain what had happened. He said he'd been comfortable. He said he'd been sleeping well. He said this without apparent distress, with a kind of warm vacancy, and they'd run tests and found nothing and released him, and he'd moved back into the apartment and slept in the bed for one night, and then moved out permanently to his sister's house in a suburb, leaving most of his books and all of his furniture and the moss-green blanket folded at the foot of the bed in its particular precise arrangement, which Mara had found and thought was simply what the previous tenant had left behind, as previous tenants always leave things behind. This was not correct. But then, this is how Blanket Writhe works. It doesn't arrive. It's already there. The building's super, who was a practical and largely unreflective man named Arthur, who had worked in the building for 11 years and who had theories about the 4th floor that he kept to himself, because he understood that saying them aloud would make his job complicated, had twice removed blankets from 4A in between tenants and thrown them away, and twice found a blanket seemingly, though he could not have said how, back at the foot of the bed when the next tenant moved in. He had stopped trying to explain this. He had also stopped going to the 4th floor after dark, which was a policy he'd arrived at through experience rather than superstition, or at least through experience that had not yet crossed the threshold into superstition, which is a finer line than most people believe. Arthur knew, without calling it this, that the blanket liked the apartment to be occupied, that it settled, between tenants, into something like patience, the way a fishing line settles when it's waiting, and that when someone moved in with the right quality, the right combination of tiredness and solitude and the practiced art of making themselves comfortable in a small space, the blanket began doing what the blanket did. He had thought, watching Mara move in with her boxes, that she had the quality. He'd felt sorry about this in the vague way he felt sorry about the 4th floor generally. He had also, in a decision he didn't entirely understand himself, made sure the blanket was at the foot of the bed when she moved in, folded in the particular way that seemed to matter, rather than throwing it away again as he usually did. He had done this because some long-accumulated sense developed over 11 years of being in the building and paying attention, in the way that practical people pay attention, through doing and noticing rather than theorizing, had told him that this one would be okay, that this particular person and this particular blanket would arrive at something other than the usual outcome. He hoped he was right. He would not know for a while if he was. On the night of the email, the job email, the unfortunately email, Mara lay in the bed and felt the blanket doing its work, and she sat up and she unfolded the edge and she said out loud, "I didn't get the job." And the room changed in the way rooms change when something that has been sealed is opened, and Blanket Writhe, which fed on avoidance, found itself in the presence of the opposite of avoidance, and was uncertain what to do with that, which is as close to disruption as something like Blanket Writhe can come. It did not stop. This needs to be said clearly. It did not stop because it is not the kind of thing that stops, because it exists in the fabric of certain old woven things, and in the particular quality of human disappearing, and those things don't stop. They are conditions rather than events. But it changed. When the fold was unfolded, when the thing was named, the quality of what it was offering changed, from enclosure to something more like attention, from the warmth of disappearance to the warmth of being witnessed, which are very different kinds of warmth and produce very different outcomes. Mara felt this difference. She might not have been able to articulate it, might not have had the language for what was happening at the level of old fabric and old presence, and the particular alchemy of a person at the edge of their own disappearing, choosing instead to stay, but she felt it. She said, "I'm lonely," and the blanket held this without amplifying it, without offering it back doubled. without producing the particular cruelty of a comfort that exists only to avoid the pain rather than acknowledge it. This is the only resolution Blanket Writhe offers. Not an ending, not an exorcism, not the dramatic liberation of ghost stories, the entity banished, the haunting over, just the nightly practice, the sitting up, the unfolding, the naming, and in exchange for this practice, warmth. Ordinary warmth, the kind that doesn't require your disappearance. She would do this, Mara, on nights when the creeping started. Not every night. There were weeks when the blanket simply lay flat and the heater clicked and the rain came and went and nothing unusual occurred, and she slept with the ordinary imperfection of a person who sleeps imperfectly, and this was fine. But on the bad nights, the nights when she could feel the weight of the unspoken things making itself known in the behaviour of the fabric, she would sit up, she would unfold the edge, she would say the true thing she had been trying not to say. And in saying it, she would remain. She got the next job, not the one she'd interviewed for, not the one whose unfortunately had sat in her inbox for 3 days before she deleted it. A different one she hadn't considered seriously, one that arrived through an unexpected channel. A friend's recommendation, a conversation she hadn't expected to be anything more than a conversation. The familiar surprise of a door, opening where you'd stopped looking for doors. She called her mother, she called her friends. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the new winter light, and felt the particular sensation of forward motion returning, tentative and provisional, but present. She kept the blanket. This might seem strange given everything, but the blanket was, in the end, honest with her, in a way that felt more valuable than a blanket that simply lay there. It showed her where she was. It showed her, with its patient creeping and its stitched borders and its muffled warmth, the exact shape of her own avoidance, and this was information she could use. She learned to recognise the signs, not just the physical signs, the creeping fold, the deepening warmth, the lines forming in the dark, but the internal signs that preceded them, the quality of her own tiredness on a given evening, whether the tiredness had the ordinary character of a day spent or the particular weight of things being pressed down, things accumulating in the place where unacknowledged things accumulate. She got better at this. She got better at catching herself before the blanket had to start reminding her. On the worst days, she still needed the reminder, still needed to sit up in the dark and unfold the edge and say the thing. She had developed a small private practice around this, not dramatic, not ritualised in any elaborate way, just the act itself, the sitting, the unfolding, the naming. Some nights the name thing was small. I'm dreading the meeting tomorrow. I ate badly today and I feel it. I haven't called back and I should. Some nights it was larger. I'm not sure I'm in the right life. I miss people I've lost track of. I don't know who I am outside of what I'm trying to accomplish. These were harder to say, harder to sit with after saying them, but the blanket held them without amplification, without offering them back as permission to disappear, and she lay back, down, and the warmth was ordinary, and she slept. Her mother visited. She slept in the living room on the fold-out, which was adequate if not comfortable, and she and Mara walked through the November city for 3 days and talked more than they'd talked in years. Not about everything, not with the complete transparency of people who have nothing to lose, but with the specific honesty of two people who have decided that they want to actually know each other. Her mother held her hand crossing the street on the second day, which was a thing she hadn't done since Mara was a child, and Mara noticed that she didn't pull away. On the last night of the visit, after they'd eaten and washed up, and her mother was established on the fold-out with a novel, Mara went into her bedroom and sat on the edge of the made bed and looked at the blanket and thought, quite simply, I'm glad it's not worse. This was not the triumphant conclusion. The triumphant conclusion would have had more resolution, more narrative closure, more of the things stories give you in place of the complicated shapelessness of actual experience. But this was what she had, and she found it was enough. I'm glad it's not worse. I'm glad I'm still here. The blanket lay flat. The heater clicked. Rain at the window, because there is always rain at the window in November. That is simply the nature of November. And she sat with it for a moment before getting into bed and turning off the